Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. Today is Detransition Awareness Day, and I have two shows that speak to the trans movement, and this is the first of the two. I hope that you will do me a favor and please like and share this broadcast so other people who are interested in these topics can join us live and potentially get questions answered or share their commentary. I will be, or we rather, my guest and I will be addressing those as they come up, with preference given, of course, to super chats and then people who are members of my community and so on and so forth. And we may not get to all comments. I'll just warn you, given the time frame that we have to work with, but we will do our best. If you are new to this channel and want to be kept apprised of the work that I do, please do go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. So, as the title says, we are here to talk about the anthropology of the trans movement and ask the question, is it a cult? My guests are Simone and Malcolm Collins, and they are entrepreneurs, authors of the Pragmatist Guides to Life, Relationships, Sexuality, Governance, and Crafting Religion. All of these books have been bestsellers, by the way, with one topping the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. And they're also advocates for pronatalism, education reform, and they have multiple channels they work across. And I discovered them through their YouTube channel, which is Based Camp, and I recommend it to you highly. You should go subscribe right now if you're not already subscribed. I've learned so much listening to them, and I'm sure I will learn much more. So I reached out and said, please come and talk with me about these issues. And they said yes, and I am so grateful. So please join me in welcoming my guests, Simone and Malcolm. Hello.
Hello. We are so excited to be here. You know, we were talking before this call, and one of the things that Simone and I like to do, and it's what we did with the Crafting Religion book, is to study how cultures and religions evolve. Like, to not take the idea that there's any necessarily malevolent actors at play, but just if you have natural cultural movement, how can specific things become popular over other things? Why might a culture have sort of one status hierarchy versus another status hierarchy? And we love applying these questions. And I want to be clear, the title of this episode is a question. This is not something that we are asserting. We are saying, if we study it, the current trans movement through the lens of how religious movements evolve, with young religious movements typically definitionally being called cults, does it have some of those aspects to it? And what really tipped me off to this, Deb, was actually watching your episode where you were interviewing a lot of parents of kids who had, you'd done 3 in a row. And I think it might be your most popular episode of kids who had gotten into the trans movement recently.
Right.
And listening to a lot of their stories, there was a lot of parallels between that and research I had done into how cults recruit people. And so I thought that would be a really fun thing for us to talk about. But what I do hope we're back on, because, you know, our core thing is pronatalism these days, and education reform is the other one. You know, we're launching a new education system with the Collins Institute that I hope can do well. But yeah, and I want to be clear before we start here, before anyone thinks we're going to go, you know, anti-trans was this or something like this. My view right now of the trans movement is that a part of it has been hijacked by a group that is far outside the original intent of the movement, and that has that's goals are deleterious to many individuals in society. And in many ways, I think that the individuals who are most harmed by this are individuals who were maybe in the early trans movement. You know, you look at an individual like Buck Angel, who is, I think, has always tried to split a moderate political line and has just been completely ousted. And I can only imagine how heartbreaking it would be, because you see this constantly with progressives. You know, after they culturally conquer an institution, they'll put an LGBT flag out front. And, you know, if it's a mosque or a synagogue or a town, and it's sort of sick when you consider the fact that in the last election cycle, 45% of gay men voted for Trump. You know, they don't have ownership over these identities. They have stolen ownership of these identities and redirected anger that should be going to this progressive cult towards a vulnerable community. I often say that the progressives love the LGBT community in the same way Hamas loves hospitals.
Right. That's an interesting way to look at it. I think your point about there being sort of the way I've heard it put is there's a kernel of truth about most of these movements in terms of there are vulnerable populations, there are people we need to, be more respectful towards or understand better or something like that, and not just demonize as being different. And then they wrap it in lots, come in, capture, wrap it in lots of things that are not necessarily true or that are designed to recruit or create a movement or to create something that is inorganic. So what you might have had before is a person who is struggling with some gender issues, and then they've decided that this is how, as an adult, they want to deal with it, et cetera. And they just want to live their lives and not be, shoved to the side, not be able to get a job or whatever. And then suddenly there's a movement. Like, this has gone from being something we shouldn't demonize to something that we should promote and recruit and make a bigger deal and, envelop more people in than it otherwise would have on its own.
I mean, I want to talk to this in two ways. So I think that there's sort of two aspects of this, if you're thinking about it as a cultural/religious movement. One is the role the trans movement plays within the Urban Monoculture's recruitment campaign. And then the second is the role the trans movement plays as a force unique and separate from the Urban Monoculture. So I want to start by just talking about the Urban Monoculture and I think why we're seeing this. So if we look at our society today, there is one cultural group which a lot of people will blame for things like wokeness, but that is vastly underselling the reach of this cultural group, which is more like broadly progressivism. And it is actually a fairly complicated cultural group, and it functions very differently than historic cultural groups. So we can get to a few ways that it functions quite differently. It's sort of evolved some unique adaptations. But this cultural group dominates our urban centers, which is why we call it the urban monoculture. And a very unique thing about it is that it doesn't require that members identify their identity with the cultural group. By that, what I mean is it allows members to continue to identify as, for example, a Catholic or a Jew or a Muslim or an atheist. But culturally, they are generally forced to give up most of the traditional belief systems and cosmology of these groups when they join it. So to give an example of what I mean when I say this, if I ask a far progressive, Christian or Jew or Muslim, what their views are on gender, what their views are on marriage, what their views are on sexuality, what their cosmology of the universe is, what their views are on morality, what their views are on our relationship to the environment, you're going to get broadly the same answers. Yet if I ask conservatives from those traditions the same question, you're actually going to get wildly different answers. And I think a lot of progressives might be surprised by how different. So for example, in the question of what do you do when someone within your cultural group is same-sex attracted? If you look at the traditional Muslim answer to this, it is gender conversion. The actual conservative Muslim answer to same-sex attraction is gender conversion. What's the traditional Catholic answer to this? Well, if you look at statistics, something like 55% of the Catholic priesthood is same-sex attracted in some studies. It is, we put you into a leadership caste within our community, and the downside to that caste is celibacy, but there are some benefits in that it causes less nepotism within this leadership caste. So there's utility in that. And you look at the Protestant, it's generally suppress and just try to live a straight lifestyle. Now, I actually think of these various answers, if I was choosing one for my kids, I would promote the answer of the urban monoculture, which is do what you want if you're same-sex attractive. But it is important to note that there isn't one conservative answer to this. There is a broad spectrum of conservative answers to these various questions because these are genuinely different cultures that have very little in common with each other. What gets interesting, or where this all relates to the pronatalist movement, is the urban monoculture as a cultural group is incredibly low fertility. Historically speaking, cultural groups, one of the reasons they're shaped by evolution is a culture that promoted behavior patterns, which led to higher fertility within it and longer lifespans within it, had more surviving offsprings, and could outcompete its neighboring cultural groups. This is how you get things like, the Judeo-Christian tradition figuring out hand washing centuries before science did. But it's also why you will get some convergent evolution where most long-lived, successful cultural groups around the world, and by that what I mean is like they spanned over a long region, had some level of homophobia within them, whether you're talking about in China or Africa or Europe. And that's not because there's some like intrinsic morality to homophobia. It's just that if you're homophobic, you will increase the number of kids had within that cultural group, right? But this becomes important for a few things. You get mental health issues when you throw all this out, but I'm not going to talk about all of that here. Where this is relevant to the urban monoculture is the urban monoculture isn't like these groups. It is low fertility. So the primary way that it keeps its population level stable is by converting people from nearby cultural groups, sort of parasitizing them, primarily their children, through using the educational system and using mass media. And when it can't do that, to keep its population stable, it has to import people and convert their kids. This, of course, creates tension between the urban monoculture and the surrounding populations. And the urban monoculture has chosen to use aspects of the LGBT movement as part of its conversion techniques to drive wedges between individuals and their birth cultures, for a reason that you often see within cults. And when I say choose, none of this was like a person, at least I don't believe, a person sat down and evilly wrung their hands. It is that if you have two cultural practices within the urban monoculture, one that says other people's kids are none of our business, and then another one that says other people's kids are our business, and we as a state or as a country basically own everyone else's kids, and we get a right to do whatever we want with them. Well, the second belief system is going to outcompete the first in terms of conversions, and then come to dominate the cultural group. So this is the where all this comes in terms of the urban monoculture. Now, the specific trans movement is a little separate from this. And if I'm talking too much, if you want to comment on this, I'll pause.
No, I'm like fascinated. My brain's going a mile a minute because I grew up in an urban monoculture and somehow escaped anyway. So it's like, I'm sort of wondering now. I want to go back and do some forensics on my own life. And like, how did I do it?
The urban monoculture is interesting in that it used to just be secularism, right? Like it genuinely optimized around trying to follow the scientific method. But as it became older, and keep in mind that wasn't this long ago, when that became a mainstream thing was probably like 1930s, 1940s. And at that point, I think it was actually a pure force for good in the world. But then it began to sort of create a priest class out of the academic institutions. And by that, what I mean is if in like the Catholic religion, I want to know what's true, I go and I ask my local priest what's true. Right. And when the local Catholic like a Catholic newspaper saying like, what's the new true thing? They go to the Pope. Well, our media, when it's trying to determine what's true, it goes to our priest casts, which are academics within our society. And they actually function a lot like a priest caste if you think about it. Most traditional societies have some coming of age ritual in which teens as a peer group leave the tribe and have to undergo some sort of trial or ordeal with their peer group and then come back as adults. That is what's happening with the university system within the urban monoculture, to the extent where if you talk to somebody from the urban monoculture, they will often view, and people know this implicitly if they have friends who are in this cultural group, they view people who haven't gone to college as not fully adults. And they have this view of they're still sort of like in a child phase of life, which is actually very normal for most anthropological cultural groups. But anyway, so it was this force for good, but mimetic sort of viruses began to spread within it, where within the university system, once these mimetic viruses had taken over the parts of the university system that didn't need to prove their efficaciousness through real world predictability. So what I mean by that is it's kind of hard for a mimetic virus to take over a physics department or to take over a department that needs to like a pollster department or something like that. It's quite easy for them
You'd
to take
like
over.
to think so.
Well,
but I'm here to tell you it's remarkably successful now.
It's doing it now, but it hit those departments last.
That is
First,
true.
it ate the stuff that didn't really need to prove anything, the arts departments, the poetry departments, etc. Then
true.
It began to make departments that were just based around itself, like fat studies department and stuff like that. Now you get universities where half of the university is supposed to be doing like real research, and then the other half of the university is basically just there to police for thought crimes against the mimetic virus, which has taken over. And we argue that this mimetic virus is new. It is not what progressivism was 20, 30 years ago. 20, 30 years ago, the goal of progressivism was equality. It was, gender equality, ethnic equality, etc. There is no, I think, better, we have an episode on this on Basecamp, better sign that they have abandoned that than that they demonize the movement Starship Troopers as being evil and fascist. Because it's like, that's a democratic society with total gender equality, total ethnic equality, and yet it is somehow evil to you. Why? Because the way you earn the right to vote in this society is you have to sacrifice. The new urban monocultural virus is not optimizing for equality. It's optimizing around removal of in-the-moment emotional pain. This is why you get the elevation of things like the Haze movement, which is the healthy at every size movement. Like, obviously it hurts people to not tell fat people that this is unhealthy for them or to pretend that the science says that, but it causes in the moment emotional pain to do that. This is why you have things like people handing out fentanyl on the streets now, right? Like, that reduces in the moment emotional pain, even though it increases inequality because, people from wealthy families can get like official treatment for this. This is why you get things like the banning of test scores. Why would you ban test scores if you're trying to increase equality? Obviously, the wealthy kids are still going to SAT prep. Obviously, the wealthy kids are still getting extracurricular tutoring. This is increasing inequality, but it removes in the moment emotional pain. This transition within urban environments to this new thing that we call the urban monoculture, this larger mimetic virus that has like other weird things about it. It has an inverse power hierarchy where it has a caste system, a very clear caste system, but they invert the power of the different groups in their caste system to be the opposite of what they perceive their opponent's perception of those groups. So if they think that like Black people are discriminated against, they will promote them to a higher order within this caste system and assign them special rights. If they think trans people are discriminated against, they get an ultra high caste, and this is actually a really powerful recruiting technique because it means when they begin to start infecting an institution, individuals of these groups that I think outside of the urban monoculture often are genuinely in difficult positions, like they have some level of discrimination against them. They realize they can flip this discrimination and gain a level of advantage by attempting to convert the organization to the urban monoculture. And because the urban monoculture is so vast right now, the organization itself can often gain through building like a DEI department, gain additional business partners, reduce the risk of some lawsuits. And now you have an organ, like a tumor within the organization that's only goal is ideological conformity within the organization and converting other parts of the organization, and that, like a tumor, sort of rewires the organizational's biology to draw more and more blood to it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that the purpose of progressivism originally was equality. And I just want to throw a monkey wrench into that, because it kind of depends which progressives you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about the original political and academic progressives, those who were already in positions of power to use, and to use that power to advance their views, they absolutely did sit in a room and they absolutely did say, this is how we're going to reshape society, because they genuinely believed I think they were crazy and wrong, but they genuinely believed they could perfect humanity and perfect our interactions with each other, and certainly sustain their own power if they could move us around like little chess pieces. And this goes from, we talked about this, John D. Rockefeller all the way to Woodrow Wilson and whole bunches of people in between with lots of money, lots of power, political and otherwise, and John Dewey and Horace Mann and so forth. So I think there's that set. And then what I think I'm hearing you say is that in the urban monoculture, sort of these, as cities, because at the same time period, cities grew bigger and more people were going to cities, because that's where economic growth, that's where the economic machine was really churning. We weren't an agrarian society anymore. Lots of people were doing that. More people starting in about 1920 were going to college in the first place. Before that, almost nobody went to college. Now we have, land grant schools and all that. Everybody's going to get a college education. And so I think most of the people who came into these, sort of funneled into that, probably were well-intentioned, oh yes, this is what we need to do and pursue equality. But I think there was always a sort of a tension between what they thought they were participating in and what they thought they were doing, and what people who were in positions of quite real power, hard power, not soft power, were up to. So I kind of want to throw that out, because I know people who watch me a lot if I just let that one go, they were like, Deb, did you change your mind? Do you think that Dewey was fine and he was benign? And he was just innocently trying to make everyone equal? I'm like, no. So
no. I agree with I guess what you're. So I guess I would change this statement a bit. The goal that they were selling to the rank and file of their organization has changed.
Yes.
At the top, there has always been some nefarious scheming and everything like that. Yes. But I guess I think that with a lot of this, when you have cities, what's really interesting is if you think of, remember how I was talking about religious and cultural systems as evolving units? Well, when you had cities, what happened was, in the same way that where did superbacteria spread, is in hospitals. When you have a bunch of immunocompromised people, all in an ultra dense setting. Well, when we began to get ultra dense mega cities, which is fairly recently in human history, and then the internet, that was the hospital. You have these immunocompromised people who are losing their traditional faith systems, all in an environment where their traditional faith systems provided some level of antivirus, if only for their own self-promotion. But they did have antiviruses sort of built into them. So these are being lessened. You get these huge populations in cities. It is only natural, only logical that simple mimetic viruses would begin to spread within these environments. So people don't know what I mean when I say mimetic. I'm talking about the idea that you can have a cluster of ideas evolve, where an idea that is good at spreading itself or better at spreading itself than other ideas is going to become more common in a population. And you can get sort of symbiotic clusters of ideas. You might have early cells where people who aren't familiar with this, it's commonly believed within biology, the reason you have mitochondria inside of eukaryotic cells is mitochondria were actually entirely different species of cells than the type of cell that became eukaryotes. It then ate the mitochondria. It then began to split, and they just worked together so well. One at specializing at producing ATP, and then the other at all the other roles of the cell. That all eukaryotic organisms, they're a mix of these two organisms, one that ate another and didn't fully digest it. So you can get these clusters of ideas that just work really synergistically. And I think that there have been multiple sort of mimetic viruses in our society. And I think most of them evolved out of older traditions or older movements. The urban monoculture, we would argue in our book, is sort of a cross of the mystic tradition and the Hicksite Quaker tradition. You can read The Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion if you're interested in that, or watch our podcast Basecamp. But if I'm okay to move to specifically trans culture, I'm okay?
Please.
Okay.
No, but
And
this was really helpful because, I mean, already, like I said, I never had thought about it before in terms of urban-rural divide or even urban-suburban. And then the way you explained how, because it doesn't do a good job of reproducing itself, and that is true. I mean, the reproduction rates in cities are like negligible, almost negative. And so they have to sort of pull in, recruit, parasite neighboring populations, or at least attract them and say, like, come over here, there's stuff that you want. And if what the trans movement, and I'm sure you're going to get into this, if what it offers is sufficiently attractive, then that can be one method of doing that, I guess.
Yeah, well, I mean, and
you'll explain.
What you talk about is a really interesting question, right? Because it's a culture that has built itself off of cultural parasitism. It does not have the core tool it uses to recruit people, as we've discussed, is we will remove all in the moment emotional pain if you join our group. This is not a very good recruitment strategy if you want to motivate the type of sacrifices that are involved with child rearing. And so this is an existential issue for them. If they stop the industrial conversion of children to this urban monoculture. And keep in mind, I'm not saying LGBT or anything like that. It uses LGBT as this like bull baiting
thing. Could
be
any of them. It could be climate stuff. It could be
it's a wider cultural thing. But yeah, if it once it converts you to this shared cosmology, view of gender, view of sexuality, view of relationships, everything like that, it has to do this because if it stops the conversion pipeline, its population will crash. It will lose political power. As we say, it's very much a bull by the tail scenario, where the bull is getting increasingly angry, but they can't let go of the bull because the bull at this point is going to turn around and be very, very mad. So even if they recognize the scale of the problem, I think this is why they're so mad about the pronatalist movement, is when we point this out, when they realize the scale of the situation they've gotten themselves into, they cannot stop the industrial conversion pipeline or the bull turns on them. And for us, I have no actual animosity towards the urban monoculture. It's just an evolved thing. It's not intrinsically evil. It's a question of, do you have to kill the spider to save the fly? Spiders can only survive. Like if I keep rescuing flies from a spider's nest, eventually the spider dies. So the best I can do is to proselytize to the urban monoculture and say, you need to change your culture and adapt in ways where you can keep stable fertility rates without relying on cultural parasitism to keep your population high. And they're like, well, our culture is superior. We can get to this in a second. But one of the things I always love is
yes, that's like, clear. They do believe that.
We're saving children's lives. Like when it comes to like when a kid is same-sex attracted and he joins our community, we save his life. Or when a kid identifies as a different gender and he joins our community, we save his life. And I say, okay, suppose I buy this. Suppose I buy that we should just do a kid exchange based on psychological proclivities. Well, this creates a big problem for you because the data is really overwhelmingly clear that people who grow up in conservative Christian households are much less affected by major repression disorder and have lower suicide rates when they are affected by depression. So do you want to do kid exchange? We get all the depressed kids and you get all the same-sex attracted kids? Is that the game that we're playing here? Like that seems obviously messed up. What they really mean is we get to take your kid and not the other way around because we're the dominant cultural group in society right now. And keep in mind, dominant cultural groups have always done this. When the Europeans came, like in Canada and stuff like this, what was the residential school program if not them? And it's important to remember the urban monoculture is a cultural descendant of European imperialism. It is not some like new culture that came out of native movements or something like that.
That's what I love is they claim to be the decolonizers and they are literally the remnants of the colonizers.
They're literally, but they use all the same tactics. They see everyone else in the same way. If you read like White Man's Burden, it could perfectly describe how they see conservative children. Like, oh, this creature, half man, half beast, half child, half beast, that they see them as savages, as deplorables. And they use that to justify, like with the residential school program in Canada, where they tried to erase native cultural traditions because they saw them as savage and as hurting the children. I, as somebody who actually broadly agrees with the urban monoculture in many of my personal beliefs, people say, then why are you fighting it? It would be like a person asking me in Canada during the residential school system, why are you fighting this if you're European in your cultural background? And it's because it's evil. Cultural genocide is evil. You need to find a way to sustain yourself without factory farming other people's children. There are certain, but I want Simone to start talking, so I just need to get the thesis out, and then I can ask Simone. So I want to get to the trans movement because it's actually really interesting.
But this is super helpful for me because, like I said, like my brain is on fire as far as just even I never even factored in anything resembling urban monoculture and everything you're saying about the parents. Fascinating, brilliant. Okay,
like,
this is why I wanted to talk to you guys. Like I'm watching your videos and my brain's going like this.
I know, I love your videos because I think what your videos elucidate for me is there is a level of malevolent intentionality behind some of this. And the way that I generally approach things is to assume no ill will. I say if there's no ill
Occam's
will,
razor does usually apply, but
how could this behavior pattern evolve? What I actually think now, after watching more of your channel, is there has been a level of malevolent scheming, which has happened to surf some of the waves of mass social interaction and cultural evolution and steer them in potentially more malevolent directions than they would otherwise go in. But it is a correlation of the two things. But I think through studying things, so if I'm right, if all of this could just evolve randomly, all of these behavior patterns that we're going to get to, even if you isolated the cabals that are in any way organizing everything, you will have solved nothing because all of this continues. In many ways, it's much worse if this is a randomly evolving cultural phenomenon and a randomly emerging cultural phenomenon than if it's led by a cabal of individuals with malevolent plans, because then all you need to do is neutralize the cabal and society returns to normal. If this is more like a cancer, if you leave 1 to 2% of the cancer, it grows back. So you
certainly don't want the cancer to spread, so you shouldn't accidentally do anything that metastasizes it in your, like we talk about with cancer. You have to be careful when you excise it because stray cells are now better able to implant themselves in other parts of your body than they were before when they were gathered around one single blood supply.
Oh God, I could go so much deeper.
I know, but I did want to say, I think that's what makes it so attractive. The reactionary responses to this phenomenon where it's all malevolent. In other words, like people do that because human beings, I think, desperately want a sense of control over that which scares them. They see it as soon as they recognize that it's terrifying, especially because it's using their children. And that strikes right at the heart of a parent. You guys are parents, you understand. And so they quickly take, those are the enemies. We have to get rid of them. That's the thing. And unfortunately, and this is something I've been trying to get across on my channel, you have to be very, very careful that you first truly understand what's going on before you react, because sometimes your reaction is the action that actually metastasizes the cancer. And you really need to, as you point out, you need to make sure that you're doing everything you can to protect yourself and your children first. Like, put on your own oxygen mask. You can't necessarily go save the whole society, but you may be able to save your own children. So there's kind of two pieces of that. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and it also with the metastasizing thing, we do an episode on this that I suggest people check out. I think it's called like the Rural Revolutions episode or something like that. It was one of our early episodes, so it'll have a different title card. Right. But essentially, we argue that the urban monoculture has actually ended up metastasizing right-wing culture by banning it from specific platforms, which has removed the leadership and control they had. So, like, if you ban something like Tumblr and Action from Reddit, okay, now it has a smaller user base, but you have no ability to control it anymore, and it's more dispersed, and it will start behaving very differently and much more aggressively. So the way that you relate to cultural groups can cause them to become more aggressive and everything like that, which is actually a problem with the urban monoculture, even outside of the urban monoculture. The urban monoculture is differentially good at converting pro-social people who want to make the world a better place. Well, this is a problem if you are removing all of the most pro-social people from all of the surrounding cultural groups in a region, because that's going to make the rural conservative cultures intergenerationally, both genetically and culturally, less pro-social, more aggressive, and more hostile, because you have removed all of the members of their group who might have been peacekeepers or the people who are looking for intermediaries between the two communities. But I want to get, before we go further, and because I want to hear Simone talk specifically to where this relates to the trans movement. So if you're looking at all of this sort of organic stuff, there's a big problem that you have in cultural movements where when a movement, it becomes culturally unfit to at all criticize it, you always get malevolent mimetic viruses. And when I say malevolent, I don't mean just the type of viruses we would normally stamp out because they're obviously crazy. We talk a lot about this in regards to the psychology movement. Psychology, my early training was in psychology as a neuroscientist. It used to be good. We used to be trained. Be careful not to create dependency in your patients. Be careful not to implant memories in your patients. It has completely gone off the rail. See our base camp episodes like trauma isn't real and stuff like that. If you want more on these subjects from somebody who was trained in this field. But when we banned criticizing people from going to psychologists, which we did, which was genuinely originally a good-hearted thing, like, oh, mental health is important. We shouldn't criticize people from going to a psychologist. Then it became to a never pull someone aside and say, I think your psychologist is building dependency in you. You really should stop seeing that individual. You're not allowed to say that. And it created really negative behaviors in psychologists because it ended up rewarding the psychologists who created dependency in their patients, and the psychological techniques that created dependency, because a recurring customer is always better than a one-off and done customer. But we're now getting to the trans movement and why this is relevant. Okay, so LGBT rights, I was in the GSA growing up. I really feel for gay rights. And as I say, a large portion of the gay movement are conservatives. 45% of gay men vote for Trump. And I think it's going to be the majority of gay men in the next election cycle, because this has been trending to the right. So it is wrong, and we are falling for the progressives' bait if we treat the gay community as our natural enemy, the LGBT community. I think historically, like the idea of, is it possible that some individuals, psychologically, whatever creates gendered behavior patterns, that there is a chance? And I know you don't believe in trans people at all anymore. I think that if you look at anything like this, like, are some people born with the wrong set of genitals? Yes, it's incredibly rare, but it does happen. Could it happen that people have different, like, gendered instincts in some portion of the population? I would think it's implausible, but that didn't happen. But I also think it's equally implausible that as soon as you've created a ban against ever criticizing anything in the trans movement within some cultural groups, which I think anyone, even like most legitimate trans people, will be like, yeah, there's some stuff the trans movement is doing that it probably shouldn't be doing right now. Especially when you go to like 3-year-old to becoming trans and stuff like that, which you've talked about, and then you get called a transphobe for you saying that's an issue. Okay, so you have this movement where it has this level of cultural protection. And this is what viruses do in the human body. Like when you get an infection or when you get like certain types of cancers and stuff like that, they will signal to your body that they're healthy and they're doing something really important. They'll say, I'm this really important thing in the body, so don't get rid of me, right? And this is like what you have as DIY departments. So if you get rid of me, you're causing racism. Like we all.
I mean the DEI.
Yes.
Sorry, not DUI. Anyway, so within this early trans movement, you have a young teen who's going into school, or a big body of young teens. A lot of them feel like outcasts. That's pretty normal as a teen. You're going through puberty, so you feel uncomfortable with your body. And a group comes along that says, if you affirm our beliefs about gender, especially if you identify with our beliefs about gender, everyone in this community will say how great you are. Everyone in this community will affirm you, but then immediately attack you and go hard attack you once you're in the community, if you disagree with any of our beliefs. This is called love bombing. It's a very common cult tactic, but it's also something that I can see naturally evolving if you're trying to protect like if trans people really exist, which I think they do, and you're trying to protect these individuals and they're in an environment like the school system, but this technique of affirming people works not just for the trans individuals, it works for any kid who feels like an outcast. You get into this movement, right? And they have a solution for why you feel uncomfortable with your body. and which a lot of people do at that age. They have a solution for you feel like an outcast in society. Well, here's why. This explains everything. We have a big rash of mental health crises, which we've argued is likely due to the co-evolving nature. Humans co-evolved with religion. We stripped that out. Now our brains don't have many of the things that they needed. So an example of this is all religious systems have some sort of arbitrary self-denial ritual, whether it's Lent or Ramadan or Feast of the Firstborn. From a neuroscientific perspective, this was likely to enhance the inhibitory pathways within your prefrontal cortex, which allow you to shoot down things like intrusive thoughts and anxiety. But now they can't shut those things down. So they deal with more mental health issues. So anyway, they stripped all that out. So they're dealing with these mental health issues. They have this community which has all these solutions for them and loves them. Who wouldn't convert? Like, even me, like, people are saying, how dare you say some people who aren't trans might become trans? I'm like, are you denying my lived experiences? Because I know that when I was a teenager, I might have found this very appealing. And yet I also know, as a heterosexual married adult now with kids, that I'm very happy. In fact, even today as an adult, within trans terminology, I would be considered trans.
Because hold
on, stop. Okay, now I've got to hear from Simone, because that's your wife. She's like, wait a
minute. Just a really important thing, this is not just almost like sometimes it seems like being trans is an afterthought with all of this. So I think really strong evidence that this is more of a cultural spread thing, that Malcolm and I see is more organic rather than, organized in any concerted fashion, is when you look at people who have become trans, there is not a lot of heterogeneity in beliefs or lifestyle. When you look at trans groups or people who have transitioned, they're going to have very similar opinions about capitalism, about the environment, just like Malcolm was saying about the urban monoculture. And if the trans movement really were just about people genuinely like realizing en masse that like all these people just really aren't the, sex that they were born or the gender that they were born, we would just see people transitioning, but maybe remaining Catholic or maybe really sticking with their original culture. You would see a lot of variation, and we just don't see that.
Which we do see with people who are lesbian and gay.
Exactly. Yeah. There's huge variation there. And then we've seen, like, with the very few trans people who have decided to not be progressive politically, to not completely conform, they catch a lot of flack. So that's
putting it mildly.
Yes.
Apostates. They get treated like apostates, which you don't see within like gay male conservatives and stuff like that. You don't see them being treated like apostates. If you look at what's happened to Buck Angel, who legitimately was probably one of the most important early trans influencers in normalizing the trans movement, and how much they have gone against him, I think that you see that there really is not allowed any degree of ideological, anything other than conformity or constant affirmation. Now here I got to talk about why both Simone and I would be considered trans, because people who don't know trans ideology might not know this. So,
well, I want to give some context too first. Yeah. So Malcolm wrote a really interesting book, in my opinion, called The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, where he looked at a lot of things and he pulled a lot of things and he looked at a lot of the existing research on sexuality in humans. And one thing that he also looked at was, to what extent people are really attached to their gender. And it's actually far more widespread, not really that people feel like they're born the wrong gender, but that they're kind of indifferent. And this is seen in a bunch of different areas, like, people not just responding to research surveys, but also the genders that people choose to play in video games. How are they just comfortable being when they're like anonymous online? Mm-hmm. So I think the bigger issue too is that a lot of people just really don't care.
But hold on, I've got to elevate this, because this is important to note within. So within the trans movement, if you do not identify with a particular gender, you're what's called agender. Okay, I do not care. If I was a woman tomorrow, I would not have dysphoria. I just wouldn't care. I'd be like, okay, I guess new social roles for me. I'm going to roll with the punches. Like, my gender is not an important thing to my self-identity. As such, I am considered agender. Agender is a form of gender queer. If you look up, and you can look at this within all the mainstream trans websites and everything like that, Is genderqueer a form of trans? Yes, genderqueer is under the trans umbrella. So I would not be wrong in saying I am trans. And Simone also doesn't particularly care about her gender, but I'll let you,
And like I said, a lot of people don't. So we're not
It's
that
so interesting.
unusual.
I can't even conceive of it. Like none of this. And first of all, to be fair, it was never even proposed as an option in my thinking ever in my life. So there's that. I mean, I knew about gay and I knew about lesbian, and that's it. That's all I ever knew. Okay. I think I remember being a child and hearing about Renee Richards, who was a man and then had a sex change, what we called a sex change operation. And I remember my dad telling me that he had actually met Renee Richards when Renee Richards was a man, and actually in social circles knew Renee Richards' wife and all these things. But that was like my first inkling that like that's doable, but it was super rare. It was like this one individual did this thing and there it was. And then I remember the Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs kind of tennis thing, and like I can play a man, whatever. But as a child, even as a tomboy who preferred male friends, who preferred playing all male sports like hardball, baseball, soccer on a boys' team, all the things, I can honestly say that at no time did I ever want to be a boy. I wanted to hang around with boys all the time, and I didn't really trust a lot of the girls that I knew. I felt more comfortable in a sort of male-dominated environment. People would often say to me, "You're very masculine," things like that. But I was very comfortable being a girl. Like I actually, thinking back, I was pretty attached to it. Just I was attached to being like the Tatum O'Neal, Christy McNichol kind of girl. And that I wanted to be that kind of girl, a guy's girl, right? But definitely a girl. And even to this day, if I think about it, if you woke up tomorrow and you were a man, I'd be horrified. I wouldn't want to be a man. And I'm actually, I think, rather attached to being female, and I never really thought about it. So it does actually surprise me to hear you say that this is a common thing. And what I'm asking you is, do you think that it is more common today because we have the possibility of the option floating around in our cultural zeitgeist and kids are hearing about it?
I mean, somewhat. So there are two parts to this. I mean, I think a big issue is that in especially progressive schools, and more schools than ever are progressive, people hear like messages of ambiguity or suggestions of being potentially trans, and they go way too far. And this actually happened to me in a different context when I was in elementary school. So like way before I reached an age of sexual maturity, way before I knew myself or anything. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. Pretty much all of my friends' parents were gay or lesbian. So I just was like, okay, people marry whoever they like. Like, there's no, I didn't understand attraction at all. So at one point, like, I think, I don't know, like at lunch or something, my best friend and I at the time were like, oh, one day we're going to get married and we're going to have 100 cats and we're going to live in a motorhome and go all around the world in a motorhome with 100 cats. So all of these things are like completely ridiculous. But of course, what all the teachers pick up on is I'm going to marry my best friend who happened to be female. So my parents get this call that Simone came out as a lesbian, and that, like, I'm not a lesbian. I just like, and why didn't they bring up the cats? Simone has a cat problem. Simone wants to be, wants to live fan life. We need to talk about this. So I think things like that are also happening where now, especially because there are so many laws and regulations in many schools about this, like suddenly if someone indicates that they're trans, oh, well, we have to protect them in this way, and this, we have to report this, and we have to do this. And the more people are legislating this on both sides, both on the pro-trans and anti-trans side, because all these rules are being created, people are making a big deal out of something that isn't even real, if you know what I mean. So that's one side of it. Oh gosh, what was the question? There's another side that's really important.
Oh, well, I just go back to like when I was a kid. Okay, it's the 70s, and where there was a thing called Free to Be You and Me. Not sure if you're familiar with it, but it was my impression as a child that the progressive, I wouldn't have called it this, didn't have the vocabulary, but the sort of progressive ideal was there are lots of ways to be a female and lots of ways to be a male. So lots of ways to be a girl, lots of ways to be a boy. And that, just because you have the certain parts doesn't mean, for example, you must like dolls or you must not play sports or all that.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, as a person who liked all the boy things and the boy toys, whatever, that was very liberating. It's like, I get to be a girl and I get to do the other stuff. And I even remember as a young teen, maybe 13 or so, feeling like very conscious gratitude for the people who had made that possible for me. So in other words, you never, when you're a child, you can never imagine being anything other than what you are, but you read history, and I was very big on historical fiction, and I would read, let's say, you know, Little House in the Big Woods, Little House in the Prairie, and think, oh gosh, they didn't have an option. They didn't have the choice. They had to do the woman things. They had to do the girl things. And if they'd tried to do the boy things, bad things would have happened. And I remember very consciously being like, I'm so grateful to our, you know, what do you want to call it? Feminist foremothers or whoever made it possible for me to someday get a job, have kids, not have, I mean, I always wanted kids, but it was like, I can wear pants. Yay.
And isn't that nice?
Aspect of gender identity that you are excited about. But I would say that I think
actually, I remembered what I was going to say, and it is important.
Good.
And I think we have to talk about it too, because I do think that this plays a role in all of the sort of like trans, and also people being a little bit more on the ambivalent end of the spectrum, like you being so surprised that in our research, we found so many people either didn't care or actually did kind of more identify with another gender, but weren't going to do anything about it. A big factor here appears to indeed be endocrine disruptors. And you can see this in the TIDES studies, TIDES, which is a longitudinal set of studies where scientists measured levels of endocrine disruptors in the first trimester blood of pregnant women. And then they measured outcomes of their children. And it appears that this disproportionately affected men or male babies, and then children and then adults. But what they found, among other things, of course, is when those babies were born, the male babies that were exposed to higher levels of endocrine disruptors in first trimester. And this is just like one way of sampling. I'm sure throughout the entire pregnancy, they were exposed to more. They had lower anogenital distance, meaning that like the penis actually didn't make it all the way up, you know, as it sort of traveled.
They didn't fully gender differentiate.
Yeah, they didn't fully gender differentiate.
What are endocrine disruptors? Like, can you give me some examples?
Hold on, before we go further, finish the study.
Sorry.
And I will answer that too. And then even when they became children, like I think around age 7 or 8, we can send you links if you want to include this in the description eventually. Sure. They found that the boys who were exposed to higher levels of endocrine disruptors also showed less male-like play, some less gender dimorphic play. They played more like girls in observed playtimes. So endocrine disruptors are things like phthalates. They're things like microplastic. They're things that sort of come from modernity and don't really belong in like our natural food systems, but end up seeping in through our skin through shampoo and lotions and through microwaving things in plastics and ordering out. And they cook a bunch of things in plastic and all sorts of things like that. It's kind of hard to avoid these things. There are many things that people can.
You can't avoid them in your blood before having a kid if you do plasma donations.
Yeah, well, there's this one study that I found where they looked at Australian firefighters and they had them donate plasma. And then over that period, like after donating plasma, which is a lot of blood, they had lower levels of endocrine disruptors, which is especially important for first-time mothers because there's a lot of accumulated.
Yeah, your first baby basically soaks them all up.
Yeah.
And then you don't have as much of a problem with second babies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I need to talk here because what's really interesting is I think that there's a number of things happening, and one that I think the conservative movement overly denies is that there is a genuine biological change happening,
exactly,
particularly in human males, in terms of how they're relating to their gender. And that you see this in studies like this. We can't try to avoid it. Of course, progressives will say, how is that a problem that this pollutant is in the environment? They don't care about pollutants at all when humans are becoming infertile, you know, by 2060.
Save the planet, except for this.
50% of humans are going to be infertile. But yeah, or when it's changing gender presentation. But we also need to recognize that one area where progressives might be onto something, where this cultural group might be onto something in terms of finding wedge issues where they can separate kids from their families, is by saying, do these strict gender systems apply to you? And then when the kid's like, no, they don't, they can begin to peel kids from their families. So what I'd suggest here is consider that there are different ways to relate to gender intergenerationally, and that you might need to culturally adapt to the changing human gender that is just really hard to escape because of these changes in our environment. But that this does not mean that gender affirming care is the right way to deal with this transition. In fact, I would argue, and I would argue on our podcast, the correct way to deal with this is likely what I would call gender denying care. And by that, what I mean is care that denies the importance of gender to individual identity, which is to say, it's just not really that important what gender you are in society right now, and to not become overly attached to different gender identities, because this is something that changes a lot as an individual is going through puberty, and that when you identify your self-worth around your gender presentation, and this is as much a problem within the far left as it is within the far right. I often look at somebody like some of these far right, like ultra red pill guys, and I'm like, he has body dysmorphia. Like, he clearly needs
Why
to
do you
see
say that?
Because when a person becomes emotionally vulnerable in some of these communities, and this is just broadly true, and I think it's toxic in both presentations of this, that you can get this form of body dysmorphia because your core identity becomes your gender presentation, or that becomes a core aspect of your identity. And historically, I just don't think that was the way that we related to
historically,
these things.
there are loads of examples of that not being the case. I mean, think about the brother of Louis XIV, who, was an amazing, his prowess in war was so great that it greatly threatened Louis XIV's sanity, and he painted himself into these amazing war triumph paintings, but left his brother out because he was way too inspiring of a military leader. And yet this guy would show up to balls at Versailles wearing the most fabulous women's clothing. So come on, people just were I don't know, sometimes he wears dresses, but do not cross him on a battlefield, I'll tell you what. And it just, you know what? It doesn't matter that much.
And I want to bring this back to what Deb was talking about, which I think is really interesting, which is to say that in her childhood, she saw different gender presentations of femininity, and she identified with one of those gender presentations of femininity and not the other, which, you didn't identify with the prairie wife. You identified with the working woman presentation. And this is because there are many different identities. Like, when we're going through these teen years, we're looking for identities, and we often are disproportionately drawn to the identities that people affirm for us during this period. And this gets to a really potentially dangerous thing that I wanted to highlight, which is when I read a lot of these trans stories and I think about it and I try to really empathize with it, I am beginning to come to the position that while maybe not all kids could end up identifying with another gender than the gender they were born, I think if you put them into these love bombing scenarios and they felt that they were otherwise an outcast, and they happen to have a sort of a polar view of the world, which is really common in autistic individuals, which I think is why autistic individuals disproportionately become trans, which you see this in the data. Most people could be convinced to form a really strong connection to a particular gender identity. And I think that, interestingly, what's happening within the trans movement isn't that different than these red pill guys who end up forming an overly strong attachment to the male identity, or the e-girls who end up forming an overly strong attachment to the e-thought identity of femininity. Within could it happen that some individuals accidentally, but if this is what's happening, then you have another problem, because it turns out, from what I've read, when I look whether this happens to the red pill guy or the trans person or the e-thought, when you get this over attachment to a gender identity presentation, it begins to consume all of your thoughts, and you begin to get serious putapidal ideation. Sorry, I know this is one word that can really
I don't even know that word. What is that?
Sorry, I'm trying to use another word so you don't get demonetized.
I thought you were trying to refer to PewDiePie. Fuelicidal
ideation, because you know what word I'm using now, right?
Yes. Starts with S and
really
with title.
Ideation around any thought that goes against this affirmation. And so then everyone around you, and this is actually really common in cult psychology, the goal of a cult when it's trying to recruit somebody is to separate somebody from their traditional support network. And that usually means their family and their birth culture. So you want to insert an idea that their family through things that other people would consider normal is abusing them, or through affirming any sort of like alternate reality is abusing them. And I think the iterations of trans ideology that saw non-constant affirmation as a form of abuse have outcompeted the other iterations because it's very useful at recruiting people and separating them from their traditional support networks that might find other, solutions for this. But this then becomes a big problem. And also their birth culture. It says, oh, your birth culture is abusive. You need to now find new cultural identity, and we can provide that for you. We've got this culture whole cloth. And all of this would naturally evolve. Like, none of this required nefarious action. All you needed to do to get the ball rolling is to have a community of people looking to, in their minds, help someone and help them by love bombing them. But then all of this becomes a lot more dangerous when you consider the fact that historically, when you had these sorts of cultures that targeted teens during these evanescent periods that we call in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, evanescent teen cultures, because they target them during periods of short rebellion and discomfort with their birth culture because they're trying to build a new identity for themselves, and often discomfort with their sexual and gender presentation because, that's a natural part of puberty. And so, they become a goth or something like that, like I did when I was young, right? Like this really different presentation. But you could easily leave these groups. And this is where this is relevant to Detransition Day, because you often can't easily leave a trans community. You're sort of signing up to be paying the community for the rest of your life in terms of your bills.
Yeah, it's like Scientology, but medical.
Well, with Scientology, you can at least truly get out of it. It is very hard.
I mean, you change your body to where you are literally physically dependent on medications to function.
Yes. And then you become dependent on the community for your safety, because you begin to see all other communities as hostile to you when they don't constantly affirm this identity.
Right.
And so in not constantly affirming to the identity, that is a form of violence to people within the community. They see this as equivalent to genocide.
Right. I want to ask
affirming me is genocide,
we've heard that. Real quick, I just want to step down for this super chat. Thank you so very much. The question is, and Malcolm, if you need to finish your thought before getting to it, but I didn't want to let it scroll on by too far. Is transgenderism a necessary stage towards transhumanism? In transhumanism, there is no need for any differences.
Well, I think that a necessary stage within transhuman, or not necessary, a necessary part of becoming a transhumanist species, which I think is the direction that the like people have seen our channel, they know that we would be what conservatives would call very aggressive transhumanists. We do things like polygenic selection with our kids. We'll be giving our kids like AI toys and stuff like that. As humanity changes, I do not think that this is the perfect end state of humanity, that we will continue to change as a species through genetics, through AI, through technology, and that we are already a species. I'm wearing glasses. I'm already a cyborg. I'm utilizing technology to augment my physical capability. Everyone on this podcast is a form of cyborg. As we begin to change as a species, gender becomes less important to us as we begin to come up with other solutions for childbirth. Because right now, you might be thinking, oh, an artificial womb could never outcompete a mother. But an artificial womb 200, 300 years from now, keep in mind, mothers' bodies naturally constrain the amount of nutrients that they're giving to the child because historically, it was evolutionarily, there's some great books on this, where it was like a competition of resources with the individual fetus, whose goal is to take as much resources as possible, while the mother's goal is to save some resources for future kids and stuff like that. So there's always been this sort of competition here that led to a limiting on the amount of, and there's actually this whole like hormonal war going on between the fetus and the mom, which is like really interesting if you study it. The fetus is signaling that it needs way more resources than it actually needs, and the mom's body has built all these systems for suppressing those urges, but like they don't always work, because this is just how evolution works. But what this means is that where was I going with this?
We were supposed to reproduce, get the kid to like a level of being self-sustaining, and then die.
What it
Like
means is that
bugs.
eventually artificial wombs that don't have these restrictions almost certainly will produce healthier kids than kids that come out of natural childbirth. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close to that, but that is a stage in terms of our journey as a species, right? Like this as we begin to disintermediate the utility of gender. And keep in mind, I'm not saying like we should be going towards this here.
Well, I'm also
saying
going to present an alternative view.
Just, if I could fit in a million years, do you really think humanity is going to look like humans today? The only way that's true is if we live under some sort of fascist government that doesn't allow anyone to augment themselves with AI or with any sort of genetic technology, which is not a future I want, where we are like constantly watched and thought crimed. Anyway, continue, Simone.
Humans evolved different sexes, or really, I shouldn't say humans, mammals, and well, many organisms. Any organism that reproduces sexually evolved different sexes for a reason. I mean, one reason appears to be pretty clearly that having one sort of high risk, high reward subset of a population, that if somehow through weird variation and genetic mutation is superior in some way, that's more fit, is able to sort of push software updates across the population much more easily. And then having a sort of more stable subset of the population that is like a safer investment, safer bet, less variation.
Before you go further, can I explain what you mean to the audience? Because
yes.
Basically, she means if you have one family that produces a few men and a few daughters, and they're like genetically, like they have some genetic advantage over the rest of the population, those men can breed with every single other person in that entire population, quickly spreading the whatever this genetic advantage this one family has. Anyway, continue.
But so I think what scares people, though, and why people like react when they hear the word transhumanism, I'm one of those people, is that there's being alive. There's you know, like the species is alive and can continue to reproduce and so on. And then there's living. And what a lot of us still believe is that there are things about that make life worth living. So in other words, we're not bugs, we're not birds, we're not cats, we're not dogs, and we're not just looking to evolve to continue the species. That quality of life matters, and that a lot of the things like love, for example, like you know, some people say, you know, faith or purpose or appreciating beauty, things like this, that there's an urge among some humans when who talk about transhumanism to make us, you know, unbelievably, you know, unbelievably resilient in terms of like nothing can kill us and we can live for 200 years and all these things. And then there are others saying, you know, I don't want that. I would rather be anti-fragile. In other words, I'd rather be more adaptable and be, you know, in my own life. And even if I'm not perfect and I have these various things that aren't so great, I haven't been engineered. Right. That's why I suggested reading the book This Perfect Day, because they did literally engineer the population to be transhuman. And then they were boring, for lack of a better.
I mean, that is one way that it could go. But here's
the other way. But the argument I'm making is that there's a very strong argument to be made that in a more transhumanist society, in a more engineered society, we're not going to see uniformity, but rather greater variation, because through greater variation, we can achieve much more interesting things. Basically, having a diverse portfolio.
I think the question is who gets to decide, because a lot of these things,
the parents, that's who gets to decide. The parents.
So that's why the research is really encouraging on this front. And obviously we don't have a whole lot of research on what people select when they're selecting for polygenic risk scores, meaning the odds of, you know, intelligence or cancer or athleticism or height or strong cheekbones, whatever it might be, right? We don't have a lot of research on that because it's just hardly available at this point. What we do have research on is what people select for with sperm donors and egg donors. And surprise, surprise, people are not selecting for like, you know, sociopathic, tall, hyper athletic, you know, like evil superhumans. They're selecting for people who look like them, for people who are cultural matches, and for people who are generally kind, funny, and pro-social. And that's really encouraging. So, you know, you talk about capacity for love, you talk about capacity for, you know, freedom and being anti-fragile. That's what people are selecting for. And they're all selecting for slightly different things because they want kids like them, to Malcolm's point.
Well, and I want to talk about something. So you talk about all the different reasons humans live. And humans, I believe that humans should be able to choose the reason why they live, where they find meaning in life. That's really important to me.
As long as it doesn't like hurt others, though.
The urban monoculture, goes against this. They don't think that you should be able to choose, right? They think everyone should live for the same reasons, which is like general utilitarianism, or negative utilitarianism even, but we don't need to get into these philosophical concepts right now. I believe, Simone and I, like, we have a sort of family theology, an area that we find meaning in our lives. People can see this on our YouTube channel, but it's around, like, when I define good, like, why is general utilitarianism defined as good by the urban monoculture? Because it's what the average person who is seeking hedonism would want the average of society to have. There's not like a good argument from my perspective for general utilitarianism being a thing of value. What we define as good is things that expand human potentiality, and what we define as bad is things that limit human potentiality. We actually use the Gurren Lagann sort of spiral energy analogy a lot here for people who are familiar with that. But
it's an analogy for those.
That everyone should be able to choose what they define as good. The thing is that if you allow some families within a population to define good in the way that we define good, the expansion of human potentiality, then those families, for their kids and within their cultural group, will engage in some level of technological engagement, whether that's eventually, utilizing, neural chips. This is actually an early thing I did, was brain-computer interface research with AI, or undergoing some forms of genetic modification, either that they choose for themselves or that is something that is intergenerationally built up within the family. Now, the reason this is important when you're talking about, like, does gender begin to matter, or does gender begin to change, is that if I have a population on Earth and 98% of the population doesn't decide they want to change, right? The 2% or whatever that still has beliefs like my family, so long as you're allowing families to do what they want to do, over 1 million years is going to evolve to look quite different from the rest of the population. And I think among anyone who's not being unrealistic, have very outsized proficiencies when contrasted with the rest of the population in terms of their ability to be economically productive and stuff like that. What really I find quite horrifying is some individuals, they hear this and they're like, what? Like, if your family does this for X generations, you'd be like 3X standard deviations, like, above the normal IQ. Like, isn't that horrible? Isn't that unfair? And it's like, is the world worse for having an Einstein? Is the world worse? Like, do we think that because of the smart people, and there is some level of genetics to how smart an individual, because of the individuals who are smarter than me in my society, my life is better? Okay. Generally, everyone benefits when you have somebody who's economically productive and pro-social. And this is also really key. If you look at intelligence, it highly correlates with prosociality. So negatively correlates with things like the possibility of graping someone, the possibility of murder, the possibility of stealing,
any form of crime, any form of crime.
But I mean, there's no question Mao was very intelligent, extremely high IQ. And so, in fact, was Pol Pot. And so, the problem a lot of people have is that while this, may be a true correlation, we've also found that there's, very high IQ psychopaths. And power is what scares a lot of people, is that all of these things sound great in the hands of people who have a proper philosophy in this. When I say proper, I mean one that understands that, I end here and you begin over there. And it is not my right to tell you how to live or actually actively try to control. But the problem is sometimes and we see this now. We see these high IQ individuals at universities, and there's no question that they are intelligent in that sense, but they absolutely believe themselves to be superior morally, ethically, and in every other way. Their philosophy is such that anybody who doesn't live as I live, anybody who doesn't make the choices I make is stupid. And you said it at the outset of this conversation, that you're basically the unwashed masses of deplorables out there in the hinterland that need to be brought in and converted and changed into the kind of person. And what I find is I feel sometimes like a Morlock, if you've read Time Machine.
Yes.
And that the people talking about the things that you're talking about, you're talking about in a sort of neutral way. But a lot of the people that I watch who are over at Davos talking about transhumanism and talking about some of these things, even trans and gender issues, they sound like Eloy. They sound like they have never met an actual human being in their lives, nor do they care to. And if they did, they'd very quickly either want to kill you, lock you up in a prison, or force feed you some kind of something to change bugs into the different kind of person and lock you up and make you basically work stock or tax stock. And this is what genuinely scares most people who are not in the urban monoculture, who look at the trans movement and they see this sort of nascent version of transhumanism and this kind of impulse to control. That human beings are chess pieces to be moved around, genetically modified, but culled, etc.
They're going to disappear. They're not relevant. So if you're thinking about, like, if you're actually trying to project forward, what does the efficacious transhumanist movement look like? The one that is actually going to transform humanity 500, 600 years from now, right? The urban monoculture dies. It dies in every scenario, except for the life extension scenario, which is one of the reasons we're so anti-life extension. A lot of people are very surprised that the pronatalist movement is typically anti-life extensionism, because they can't motivate childbirth within these communities. So they can have their little transhumanist fantasies, but they're all dead at the end of the day because they can't motivate reproduction within their populations. And the ones that do survive will be, the life extensionists living in their cryotubes, because, we're not that close to good life extension technology right now. And so they're not really relevant if you're thinking about actual, like, where does transhumanism go?
So we're going to so regular people are going to outlive them, is what you're saying.
No, the regular people outlive them, but then there's groups that are intergenerationally transhumanists. Like, you could say, like, Simone and I would be an example of that, because we do things like polygenic selection with our kids, which is seen as a form of transhumanism. And, like, we're not against, AI technology or anything like that, or neurochipping. I worked early in my life with brain-computer interface. That was one of the areas of science that I worked at. I worked at one of the first companies in the space that brought the technology to the general public.
Right.
These families are actually intensely pluralistic. And they're pluralistic for two reasons. They're pluralistic because it's the only way we save humanity 1.0. And they're pluralistic because they don't want other groups to attack them for just doing what they want with their own family and their own lives, right? Like, I don't want people messing with my kids as much as you don't want people messing with your kids. We have our own cultural practices. One of those is the intergenerational, like a commandment that we believe we have from God, is the intergenerational commandment of human potentiality. But where this becomes interesting from the position of even humanity 1.0, even totally unaltered humanity, is you're like, no, I have decided that I don't want any group to be able to intergenerationally aim towards the expansion of.
Well, that's the flip side of the same coin. So that, I mean, I hear you. I wouldn't want anyone in a position of power to say you can't do what you're doing with your family, but I also wouldn't want anyone coming into power and saying everyone has to adopt Malcolmism or whatever. And that's all I'm saying.
We don't want everyone to. We, as Simone said, we believe that different people will choose different ways to attempt to improve themselves. And only through this diversity can we determine what is actually right. And it's like, it's central in stuff that we write. Like, we talk about this all the time. Yeah. It's one of the things where people are like, oh, so you guys are like some sort of like cultural Darwinists in terms of like how you think culture works. And it's like, yes, but what everyone forgets about Darwinism is diversity, real ideological diversity. Progressives don't have ideological diversity. They say we value diversity, and yet there's no difference between men and women. There's no difference between different cultures. There's no difference. Then why does diversity matter if no one's actually different? We believe people are different, and that difference is how humanity intergenerationally improves. But the point I was getting at is why it's important for humanity 1.0. So suppose a group does say, well, we can't allow any part of humanity to potentially improve itself. Well, this is all fine and well now if you build a totalitarian government on Earth and you prevent anyone from engaging in these sorts of technologies. But then when humanity takes to the stars, okay, eventually, and you maintain this sort of fascist, like, control over the way people breed, the way they interact with technology. This then becomes a very, very big problem when some far-flung space station somewhere or some far-flung planet somewhere begins to overturn these practices and happens to engage with this technology. Because now what you've done is, if they genuinely are able to create an iteration of humanity that has increased proficiencies, that iteration of humanity can only survive by going back and killing all the rest of humanity, because it knows that the rest of humanity will kill it if it ever finds it. Declaring war on things that are better than you, whether it is AI or humans, like this is one of the things I don't get with the AI safety movement. We're going to kill any AI that can pose a threat to humanity. It's like, well, then it has to pose a threat to humanity. You just said
you just said you're going to kill it.
Yeah, you're gonna kill it. So don't we talk about this in one of our things, saying that we need to have sort of a covenant of the children of man, which is to say that the core sort of thing that we all agree on is that any cultural group that tries to enforce its value system on another cultural group or tries to subjugate another cultural group, that is the enemy, and all of humanity needs to band against that. Whether that is,
I'm down with that. I see it right now. I mean, I see it playing out. So, but getting back to the trans thing though, because this is all like super fascinating, but no, it's important. I think it's important to explain, because there are people who ask, is the trans movement the first step towards transhumanism? People are scared of it. They have a variety of reasons for being scared. And I think
I would just say, if you look at transhumanism and then you look at transhumanism is typically about optimizing. It's about improving. It's about not compromising. And when you look at the trade-offs that people make when they choose to transition, you're looking at osteoporosis, you're looking at drops in IQ, you're looking at basically
sterilization.
So what you're looking, never having an orgasm. Like these are sacrifices that people are making. Transhumanism is totally the opposite. Is how do I become smarter, faster, better, whatever, like I need less medication, need less maintenance. So you could actually think of transitioning, gender transitioning is completely the opposite of what transhumanism is.
Interesting. So that's really good to point out, because like I said, I think a lot of people feel like this is a step towards something that will be worse.
It's like Sid from Toy Story. I don't know if you remember Sid from the original Toy Story.
Yes, I remember Sid.
Is he a roboticist? Is he a scientist? No, he's a guy who's messing around and mixing about parts to try to make something interesting to him. It's about an aesthetic optimization, which I think is the antithesis of at least what our faction of transhumanism cares about. We do not care about aesthetic optimization or optimizing around affirming an identity. We are about trying to improve humanity's capacity for understanding. That's what we believe we have a goal to do, to improve our ability to understand the world, and thus to improve our ability to worship God. That's sort of the way that we see this.
Right. Okay. So step down. Thank you again for the super chat. It says 2 sexes, but an infinite amount of personalities and mood combinations. Not sure where that comes from. And it says, also, what about considering people who refuse to use cis as transphobics? Now, I'm going to go on record before anybody else answers and say that I won't use the term cis. There are men and there are women, as we're speaking in terms of chromosomes. Okay. That there's a XX and XY. And obviously there are variations in terms of chromosomal. So, okay. But there are men and there are women, and I'm not going to make the person who is deciding they're neither of those the standard and then modify the actual standard. I'll go the other way. I'm comfortable saying to somebody, trans man, trans, whatever term we've decided we're going to use. I'm not comfortable making that the standard and saying cis woman or cis man. I'm not doing that. I won't do. That's my personal ethos. You guys can.
Well, I mean, I see this as a religious issue. I mean, I actually think that it's much easier to coexist with these communities when you see them as just a different religious framework. When I meet, a Catholic priest and I call him father, I do that because I know that he underwent enormous sacrifices to achieve something that is important within his cultural tradition. Now, I don't think that he's a father. I don't think he's my dad or something, I don't assign in my mind any particular special status with that. But I also see no need to pointlessly hurt somebody's feelings when something they underwent a lot of hurt. One thing we have to say about trans individuals is they have undergone an enormous amount of often personal sacrifice, cost, and endeavor to achieve this gender status within their community. And this is why I would never misgender somebody if I can. Sometimes it's hard. Like, I don't know what to do and it's hard to remember all the pronouns and everything. But if it's important to them, I just treat it like it's a different religion. But I also think what I talked earlier, because I think this is really important, if you see this like a different religion, like this is the way their religion and their cultural cluster relates to a child of theirs that does not conform to normal gendered behaviored patterns. Whereas our cultural subcluster, like the one that Simone and I have, we would just tell them, well, gender really isn't that important. Whereas a more conservative Christian subculture, and in fact, we would say that to over focus on your gender is a form of sin, because you are elevating your personal desires and satisfaction over your efficaciousness, and as such, within our religious system, that's a form of sin. When you put yourself as the focus of your actions.
That's what the trans movement tends to do, though. It's a kind.
Of course.
At this point, it's a kind of a cultural narcissism, that says that self-actualization or self-affirmation, and say, you're allowed to self-diagnose. What other condition is there on this earth that you get to self-diagnose that requires this much treatment? And now there's probably insurance coverage and all these things that are being demanded. That it's not just be polite to me and use pronouns that I like, and call me whatever the name I ask. It's pay for me to undergo these sacrifices. So you're asking other people to make sacrifices as well.
This is where I do have a problem with the way the trans movement has gone. So I'm explaining my rules around this, but I also have rules for society. Like, remember I talked about like subjugation and stuff like that. Like, if I'm going to say, sure, how do you optimally structure society? When you have a culture that attempts to enforce its cultural values through government systems as a mandate on other cultures, I think that is evil, and it should never be allowed within a well-functioning democratic society. So an example of this could be Muslims demanding that non-Muslims not draw the Prophet Muhammad. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say people from another cultural group. That is violating consent with that other individual. While I personally wouldn't pointlessly hurt a trans person by misgendering them, when they use the government to say somebody from a different cultural tradition has to relate to gender when interacting with him in the way that they relate to gender, that is violating another culture's consent.
And that's public school. That's public school right now.
It's a courtesy when someone from another culture or tradition or religion plays with that foreign religion's terms and abides by its etiquette, right? That is a courtesy. It is a courtesy if we say, "Oh, hello, Father Mike," or
you cover your hair to go into a mosque.
Exactly.
Take your
shoes but it is not. It should not be a universal rule. I would say to your point, though, I don't see of any other issue in which people get to self-diagnose and demand this and that and all these medical interventions and government interventions. I think another element that's really damaging of the urban monoculture, as we call it, or you could call it woke culture, hyper-progressive culture, is that this is also showing up in mental health crises. So not only are we having a bunch of people who are demanding a lot of medication and other things in response to what we think is sort of a growing cult or mimetic virus, you also have a lot of people who are saying, well, I have severe anxiety. I have, a lot of mental disorders. I have trauma. I have PTSD. I have all these things. I have to be on disability. I have to be unemployed. I can't work. I can't come to work. You need all these excuses and all this additional support.
Accommodations.
And lots of medication, tons of medication.
Which is now going into our water supply. So the rest of us have to, figure out better ways to get water so that we're not consuming all the medications they've elected to consume. And so all of this feeds into I think the non-monoculture, those of us who aren't part of that monoculture and aren't willing to play along, it feeds into the frustration and the temptation to react.
Yes.
Because we genuinely feel under threat. So I have people in my audience right now listening to us. So I know their children, they feel like their children are literally under assault, that they just want to send them to school and get an education, read, write, learn to do math, whatever. And they were, their money's been taken from them. They've been led to believe they could send their kids to these schools to do this. And instead they find themselves waging a daily battle to keep this, as you just described it, religious tradition, or this way of viewing the world and viewing people and viewing gender, from grabbing their children, if not literally to say, oh, I'm trans now, but to take their mind and turn it to, I must genuflect to the trans culture, even if I'm not part of it. I'm a dhimmi now. My culture is subjugated.
Well, it is subjugated, and I think to pretend anything else is to put your kids into a dangerous situation. The closest historical analogs for what we're looking at today in society was this one really dominant cultural group would probably be something similar to being a Protestant in a Catholic monarchy, or a Catholic in a Protestant monarchy in a historic context, or to be a Jew really in most
Anywhere,
parts of Jewish
anytime.
history. And when we look for how do we defend against this, because it is and to call it a religion, like, I don't care. Like, people are like, well, how are you defining it as a religion? It doesn't really matter. It's acting like a unified cultural system. And historically, when we are understanding unified and imperious cultural systems, they have generally been religions. So if I'm looking for historic analogs to what's going on now in terms of one culture imperiously attempting to impose its value set on all other cultures around it, I look to these historic contexts. And so when I'm looking to, like, for me, if I don't think that this is a healthy way to relate to a kid who's questioning their gender during puberty, like, and I do not think that the affirming care strategy is the correct way to relate to this in terms of long-term efficaciousness or happiness or anything. I think that the way to fight this, like within a family unit, like, is to understand that you are a minority religious tradition. And if you're just a true secularist, like if you just believe in like what actual peer review data actually says, you are still a minority religious tradition that is, and a lot of true secularists really freak out when they first realize this, when they see that they're getting tarred and feathered by the urban monoculture for just talking about statistics or science. And they're like, whoa, I thought you said that you cared. No, they don't care about this. You're still a religious minority if you're just a pure atheist. But anyway, you got the way that you protect your family in this context is to make sure that they grow up understanding that they are a religious minority that is out of step with the dominant cultural group, and that cultural group is going to attempt to convert them. And this is historically, when you were Jewish kids in a majority Christian country, this is what they did, and they had pride in their cultural traditions. But this means that you need to. So you look at what my family has done. One of the things we do on our podcast Basecamp is we basically have a religious system that we've created for our kids. Pretty much, it's a continuation of the Abrahamic system, but it's heavily altered to both work more with like our beliefs about the world, but also work better against the urban monoculture as like a defensibility, defending against many of its best attacks that it's been able to use against other Abrahamic traditions. And people would be like, well, why are you doing this? Like, why frame it this way? And I think for me, the best protection I could have had if I had been going into a world like the world we're going into right now with an urban monoculture and its various recruiting techniques, is to see these techniques the same way I would see like a Scientologist coming up to me and asking me to do a thetan reading. Like my brain is immediately like, oh, cult. I know what they're going to do. I know how they're going to do it, etc. And I don't need to be mean to them, I can respect that they believe this and everything like that, but I also know how to disengage. I think if we treat this like just a peculiarity or like an enemy, because if I teach my kid, oh, these people are the bad guys, well, what happens? They then meet a trans person, they become good friends with this trans person, and they're like, oh, they're not bad guys. They affirm me. Everyone else is mean to me. How can they be the bad guys? And then that's how the community gets to them, right? So instead of saying these guys are the bad guys, you say they are a different religious system than us. Okay. Whatever you mean by that. This is what our religious system believes. This is what their religious system believes. I have pride in my religious system. And I also don't think that their religious system leads to particularly good long-term mental health outcomes. And I would suggest you look at what happens to people who live in the urban monoculture and choose their life paths. Like, are they happy when they're like 50, 60? I mean, objectively, they're not. Since Pew has started recording data, progressives have been less happy than conservatives. Objectively, they have more mental health issues. Something like 50% of white women under 30 who identify as progressives have a serious mental health issue. Like, their system isn't working. So it's not hard to convince them, but you just need to then tell them, okay, so how do they get you? In the same way that we used to warn kids about drugs and stuff like that. Like, what does it look like when they're coming to get you? with kids, when we warn them about drugs, the place where we really failed in those warnings is when we made the person offering drugs to them look like a bad guy, look like somebody who's not one of their friends, look different, look creepy, be some old guy, instead of being their best friend of 10 years, who's one day like, hey, I tried the thing. It makes me feel good. Maybe you should try it and you'll feel good too. When you warn them about the way that drugs first actually enter their lives, you can better help protect against mimetic viruses insofar as these things are mimetic viruses and there might be other solutions to them. Another really important thing is that you do not overly demonize these things or really demonize them at all. Because if I tell my kids, like, I will be mad at you if you begin to engage with trans ideas and stuff like that, or if you begin to feel like you weren't born into the right body, well, what I've done is I have told them not to tell me if they begin feeling these thoughts, which then allows these communities to use these thoughts as recruiting tools. If I tell my kids, look, if you feel like you're born in the wrong body, like there are all sorts of things that we can do that don't involve like a gay deconversion camps or something like that, right? Like which cause you to lose them. To make them feel more comfortable, to help them build a good friend group. But when so there's a lot of, I think, things that people intuit, like this is the way I deal with this. And these are systems that are passed down to them by their cultural traditions, like their religious cultural traditions, because their religious cultural traditions are used to being the dominant cultural group in the regions they operate, which meant that if they were sending a kid to school and the kid was having a different ideas about religion or cosmology or gender identity, those schools would tell the parents, and you not being allowed to have these ideas worked very well as a cultural strategy within that context. But that's not the context they're in anymore. And this is what we mean when we tell people, like, you can't go and approach a fight with the urban monoculture by going back to tradition, because the traditions that you're going back to evolved in a pre-industrial context, or you can say were optimized for a pre-industrial context, and you are now fighting in an industrial context. This is like, the colonists have landed on your shores, and the last 3 waves of guys who ran over the hill with spears all got mowed down. And you turn to the guy next to you and you go, look, I don't think these spears are going to work. I don't care that you've put prayers on these spears. Last 3 rows just got mowed down. We need better systems if we're going to fight this.
Okay. So thank you again, Step Down, for the super chat. The question is, non-binaries demanding a new binary system ironic? So there's that category of non-binary, which it sounds to me like
too binary.
What you're describing is people are just kind of neither here nor there about the traditional
non-binary, I think, is an interesting cultural evolution that happened with the trans movement, because it basically, so within progressive culture, remember how I talked about the inverse caste system that they have, where like the more discriminated you are, the higher caste you are within the culture? Well, this creates a big
intersectionality.
If you're like a middle-class white girl, right? If I'm a middle-class,
at the bottom of the barrel next to the white men.
or a middle-class straight white man, I'm bottom of the barrel. Yet I want to engage with this culture. I want to be respected. I don't want to hate myself. So what's a solution to this? Because maybe I'm not actually trans. Maybe I don't identify as trans. Just about anyone can find a way to identify as non-binary. And now, you're one of the protected classes. So it's
very appealing.
Really powerful cultural innovation, because when you begin to include things like agender, like I don't really care what my gender is, which like 25% of people have, non-binary, sometimes I feel like a different gender, which another big chunk of the population has, you can now get to a point where like technically something like 60 to 70% of humans can claim this trans identity, which in our view would make the identity meaningless. So you're not really a discriminated minority group, but in their view is actually super important, because what they're not claiming with these is an identity. They're not saying, really, I'm non-binary in a meaningful sense. I mean, all humans love to be told characteristics about themselves. This is why you have things like zodiac signs, or like the blood personality system in like East Asian cultures, or Myers-Briggs stuff. It's like a thing that we have. So one is they love this identity. That's why you get like the flag proliferation and everything like that. It's like, oh, now I know what my identity is, during an age when they really struggle with finding an identity. So this is where you get like cloud gender type stuff. But the non-binary is a different thing. The non-binary is a way to allow really anyone to claim this alternate gendered perspective, which causes them to be shamed by general society, but raises their status within progressive cultures. So I need to take a step back here and talk about how cultures judge status. So when you have a different cultural system, like say Goths, like this is an evanescent team culture, right? Within a Goth group, there will be a cultural hierarchy. But when I meet a new Goth group, that cultural system will judge my assumed position within this hierarchy by how differentiated, like how many costly sacrifices I have made that make it so that mainstream society won't accept me. So like the more face piercings I have, the more ear gauges I have, the more crazy hair I have, the more I spent on goth outfit, the higher status I am with this new population of goths I haven't met before. And this is just true across the way sort of subcultural groups work. Well, this is also true within progressive culture. They need to adopt things into their identity, which make life harder when they're engaging with groups that are outside of the urban monoculture. And this is why they wear these things like fashion. They put the pronouns in their LinkedIn bio, which is saying, I identify with this cultural group and here is my status within this cultural group. And there are different levels to which they can identify. You know, if they're still he, him, well, then they are lower status because they're showing that they're sort of willing to engage with outside cultures, but at least they're sort of outing themselves as buying into this larger cultural ecosystem.
Well, that remember before the show, I said that I'd read something today that I thought might be worth reading to you to get your reaction, because so what you're describing now is you're describing a very pragmatic way or pragmatic reason that somebody might say I'm non-binary, or even for that matter, trans, because in both cases you get that same status confirmation and so on. But there's also an idea that was put forth in this book, Saint Foucault by David Halperin. And this is what he says. This is defining queer, because what it sounds like, non-binary is often put out there with, queer, and that the people who espouse what we call queer pedagogy in the schools will make no bones about it, that they are pushing the idea that everyone is or should be queer. And here's what David Halperin wrote: queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or stable reality. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. As the very word implies, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some determinate object. It acquires its meaning from its oppositional relation to the norm. Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant.
So this is, I think, and I think that this is a huge mistake that a lot of conservatives make, is they underestimate how ready, especially the gay male community, which was if you look historically, it was actually fairly rare for women to be born attracted to the opposite gender. Most women are closer to the middle of like gender attraction spectrums. We could get on this, but gay men are definitely a very common phenomenon in humanity. You see them cross-culturally, and it seems to be a very now imagine you have this subculture that you've built up as gay men because you were genuinely discriminated against group, which caused cultural isolation, which led to a degree of cultural differentiation. And this was important to you because you'd actually undergone challenges, for being this discriminated group. And now that has been completely hijacked by a movement which basically says everyone is queer now, insofar, and keep in mind, when they say fight dominant cultural groups, they are unwilling to admit that the urban monoculture is the dominant cultural group, even though it obviously
isn't that ironic? I'm like, y'all are the ones who can talk out in the grocery store openly about whatever you feel like. And if I open my mouth to say anything, I'm going to get beat up.
You put flags on every street corner, on every mosque once it turns progressive, on every synagogue once it turns progressive. Do you get people fired for, and in Canada potentially arrested for saying things that are critical of your community? Are you really claiming to not be the dominant cultural group? Could somebody? No, seriously, could somebody get fired for saying something negative about Christianity from a major corporation these days?
Never.
No,
definitely
obviously not. Could they get fired for saying something critical of the trans movement, or that could be construed as critical? Obviously, you are the dominant cultural group, but they have defined things in this inverse style. When they really mean, when they talk about the dominant cultural group, what they're talking about is the savage cultural groups, the cultural groups that they believe they have a mandate to commit cultural genocide against, i.e. to erase from this planet. The progressive cultural system, it says we can still have people who, oh, cute, you identify as Catholic, that's fine. You can keep a few holidays. You can maybe dress a bit differently, but don't differentiate from us on any mainstream ideological perspective. And we're going to spread to every corner of the world. We're going to go to Africa. We're going to go to Latin America. We're going to go to China. Everyone will eventually part of this one dominant cultural system. And that's what makes the system evil. And right now they're identifying everyone they see as another cultural system as the dominant culture, because that's sort of how they've framed themselves in a historical context. But it allows them to, for anyone, like I was saying, anyone now can identify as having an alternate sexual identity, because they've so broadened the terms around things like what is trans.
A super easy entry point into the dominant culture.
Exactly.
Easy peasy. I'm queer. Okay, welcome. Like that. There you go. You don't even have to change your appearance if you don't want to. You can just say it. I've seen people do that. I've seen
higher status
no different at all, and they just announce that they're queer, and it's like you're all better now.
Yeah, so I think that's what's happening there, and I would say, and I always want to bring people back to this: the group that is most victimized by this particular perversion,
actual gays and lesbians,
like actual gay men, got. I can't even imagine growing up in an era where you could be like killed and dragged behind a car and fighting to normalize it. And then the moment you do, not the moment you do, well, let's say like 25 years later, it's now been completely taken over by a movement that is ideologically nothing in common. You were fighting for everyone to be allowed to do whatever they want, for relationships to be a matter of consent. And now you have a group that doesn't care at all about consent. You are going to gender me the way I tell you to, and your consent has nothing to do with this. There is no intercultural consent. And yeah.
Is that more how, because, you know, we were talking about, is it a cult? That's the question that we're asking. Is that more aligned with how cults behave?
No, I don't think cult is a meaningful term. So what I would say is I use the term cult because it was caustic and would get people to watch the podcast. I don't think cult is a meaningful term. I think that cult is a new religious movement is generally the way it's used. Is it a new religious movement? I mean, it has some things in common with a religious movement, but it's not a full religious movement because it's not self-sustaining. It's a bit like asking the question, is a virus alive? A virus needs other cells to replicate itself. The urban monoculture needs groups to parasitize to stay alive because it can't motivate reproduction on its own. So it's not really a full religious system.
But it does have similar features. It has characteristics like the love bombing, the separating you from your standard support system. And so it obviously has no redemption, so we wouldn't call it a religion. It doesn't offer anything constructive, so we wouldn't call it a religion. But it also is grounded in a belief system rather than objective reality or data. So we wouldn't call it science, you know, or scientific.
The analogy I often use here is in dogs. There's something called canine venereal tumors. They're called transmissible. It's a type of tumor that is contagious. So thousands of years ago, a tumor emerged in a dog that just happened to be able to transfer to other dogs. And now, in a way, that one dog is still alive, living in all of these other dogs that have caught this canine venereal tumor.
Oh
well, this is relevant here because it's like, is that canine venereal tumor a dog? It has the DNA of a dog. It has some of the cell clumps of a dog, but it survives by predating on dogs. It's not really a dog. It can't survive without dogs.
I got you.
Is the urban monoculture a religion? Not really. It can't survive without religions around it motivating reproduction in their populations. And
it also has so many political characteristics, and that brings up this question from Step Down. Thank you again for the super chat. It seems to me that queer is a political stance more than it is a sexuality. The program of queerness is through and through destabilizing, and it sounds like you're agreeing that it's destabilizing because of its inability to. I mean, it has to parasite, and it is the dominant culture inverting itself, claiming to not be and conferring status and things like that.
That's exactly what we've been saying. It's a cultural identity that is taken on almost like not like a fashion statement, but a personal identity that helps people decide who they are during a stage in their life. This is the whole reason you have this whole diversity of gender identities, is because they are confusing. And you see this within the Tumblr era, these ultra unique gender identities with sort of prepackaged personality profiles that help them feel a sense of belonging that a lot of people go through during that stage of life, but that also affirm connection to this one cultural group. The problem being that, and the new cultural innovation being that once you transition, you can't easily leave that cultural group as historically you might have been able to.
Right. Do you think there is I mean, aside from the people at the top collaborating, right, and everybody else just sort of like trying to comply or not comply, do you think that the people, the individuals on the ground who are part of this culture saying you will do my pronouns, do you think they have an end game, or do you believe they're trying to eliminate something or actively trying to change something, or do you think that they are caught up in this once they get into this culture or whatever it is, that, as you just point out, they can't extricate themselves, and they don't even try. They just sort of instinctively know I'm in it and I can't leave.
The best time to convert someone to a religion is between the ages of about 15 to 23. If it was a cultural system that was just simply evolving, it naturally would end up targeting that age range. I think it's just that the iterations of the culture that heavily targeted people during that age range outcompeted the iterations that didn't. The iterations of the culture that ended up thinking that other people don't really have ownership over their own children outcompeted the iterations of the culture that didn't. But
they're not trying to get rid of capitalism or something. Like, in
Well,
other words, they're not.
I mean, some are, but that's when they're like really politically active.
Right.
Yeah, I think even if you got rid of the portion of the community that was trying to get rid of capitalism, even if capitalism wasn't a thing, this would still emerge. Like, this behavior pattern persists because it's a cluster of behavior patterns, like the love bombing, the affirmation, the age ranges that they're targeting, the disproportional movement into educational and media roles, which are good for proselytizing. All of those traits sort of work together in a big cultural package, which is going to spread even if you didn't have any intentionally malevolent actors. So Occam's razor, I assume the malevolent actors aren't what's driving this forwards. Now, here I need to be clear. I think there are malevolent actors, and I think that they believe that they're powerful and they're important to what's happening and blah, 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 blah. But I just think that they're sort of idiots dancing on a wave. What I mean by that is the wave's moving forwards regardless of their little evil chant. They're just doing it because sometimes when people see an opportunity for power or to feel powerful, they will take that opportunity. But I don't know if now there are instances in which I think individuals have pushed things forward much further than it would otherwise go.
And backwards. Today we had, in a good way, today the UK announced that the NHS will no longer allow the distribution of puberty blockers to children.
Oh, wow. That's huge.
Yeah. So that was just out, like, right before we came on the air. It was announced that that's done. It's over.
So am I still transphobic if I say puberty blockers have systemic issues when given to minors in terms of the long-term consequences? I don't know. When do we decide that saying some like statistical things aren't transphobic? I don't know when.
I honestly don't know. But it as of today, that's over. So now a lot of people are saying, okay, Canada, okay, United States, what's next? And of course, the WPATH files came out, and that's a whole other podcast. But so there has been pushback. Now, to your point, and I know we probably need to wrap up because we've been going almost 2 hours, but that these things have kind of a life of their own because they're at their core sort of cultural movements that have certain organic traits to them. But it looks like there's been some pushback, at least insofar as children and the kind of parasitism that would take children who really can't make their own decisions. We're not talking about adults deciding, oh yes, I'll come be part of your religious sect or your belief system or your culture or anything because I can weigh the consequences and do it. But we're talking about little kids. But it sounds to me like what you're saying is, even when you do that, even if you get rid of the puberty blockers, even if you stop teaching this stuff in the schools, you will still have a movement that is a movement, and it's not what's going to kill it is people dying. I mean, in other words, aging out, not reproducing. And
the only thing that kills it is making other cultural groups resistant to it.
Okay.
So if you build systems that prevent your kids from being predated upon by these sorts of groups, then good, you can survive, right?
So
And once we spread the vaccine, once we spread the vaccine enough, eventually
the vaccine of ideas. He's talking about ideas.
Vaccine of ideas, a mimetic vaccine, because the group can't get more converts and because they're not reproducing on their own, they just disappear, or an iteration of the group that is reproducing on its own emerges, which I am totally okay with. I have nothing against the trans parents raising and birthing trans kids, and maybe they.
So you really think that there's no, see, this is where I probably disagree with you, because I think if a parent plants the idea in a child's head that they're in the wrong body, that there's something that needs to change fundamentally that will cause them permanent, sterilize them so they won't ever be able to reproduce on their own. And that's a choice they don't even comprehend as a small child. That, we know statistically that as soon as you start socially transitioning them, especially at a young age, the likelihood that they will desist goes down. The social transition, then the pronouns, then the medical transition, that, you're still communicating that if something is fundamentally physically wrong with the child, in the world of me, that's abusive.
Well,
I don't
hold on.
think that's
So I'll create a counterpoint here, right? Like, I think when we begin to say other cultural systems cannot practice certain child rearing techniques or certain child rearing practices with their kids, we end up with stuff like the banning of circumcision, which I see as being blatantly anti-Semitic. And people will be like, well, circumcision should be banned. It's not the kid's choice, blah, 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 blah. And then I would say, okay, well, the best person to decide to not circumcise their kid is somebody who was circumcised themselves. And if it turns out that the Jews who were circumcised, and choose to circumcise their kids also are still having more kids than the Jews who have chosen not to circumcise their kids, which I think is going to be blatantly true if you look at the data. It turns out that circumcision was likely playing a cultural role that we didn't fully understand. The moment I begin to build a logical justification for imposing my value system on their parenting techniques and their child rearing, I justify them doing the same to me. And I think it's much easier to just create a system where you say, and somebody's like, well, what if they kill their kids? Or what if they abuse their kids? And I say, well, in a society where we couldn't leave our birth cultures, those might have been very powerful strategies to keep a kid within a culture. But right now, I mean, look at the 8 passenger situation, right? Like, she treated her kids very abusively. She had 8 kids, and those kids have all left their culture and their religion, because now abusing your kids to try to get them to follow your cultural system is a very bad cultural system and will naturally go extinct.
Well, that's true, but I just wonder if a civilized society does have, in terms of rights respecting civilized society, if we do have some kind of a moral obligation to, not allow certain levels of abuse. So in other words, if parents want to raise their kids to think that gender is not important, obviously that's irrelevant. But to say your body's incorrect, you were born in the wrong body.
You're doing abuse. They would say that you're doing that with kids. Like keep in mind, abuse can be defined. However, the definition of abuse changes between cultures.
But there's reality, though. There's like a person is born with one set of gametes or the other, one set of parts or the other. And I guess for a parent to communicate to the child, like, this, your body's broken.
But reality changes depending on your sort of cosmology and metaphysics. So for them, an individual is whoever they think they are. To them, that is the highest level of reality. And I think look, from my
I probably can't go there with you. So.
Yeah, you can't go there with us. But here's why. Look, if we decide that we are okay with this level of cultural imposition, right, and our group wins, because right now this is what society is. It's a collection of these out-group conservative factions, these against the urban monoculture, right? Well, suppose we one day defeat the urban monoculture and we haven't enshrined in this sort of cultural alliance that people get to raise kids the way they want. Well, then what happens is the dominant cultural group within this alliance, say it's ultra-Orthodox Jews or evangelical Christians. Now they're going to start imposing their child-rearing techniques on me. I don't want them imposing their techniques on me any more than I want the urban monoculture imposing their techniques in me. As soon as I say that some group gets to choose like what's objective reality, this abuse becomes inevitable at a societal level. It just changes depending on who's the group in power.
Well, I mean, I agree with you for the most part. I guess where I draw the line is what I do believe is observable reality, and in the sense that, you know, like a person's body is their body. It doesn't, but like my child's body doesn't belong to me, and I just think certain kinds of modifications that are. I mean, it's weird because I probably sound inconsistent to say, okay, I can go with you on the circumcision thing, but I have trouble with and we're going to take you in and get you a double mastectomy thing. That
I would also point out how much of personality is genetic and how much of culture transmits between generation. The parents who are doing this with their kids are already largely predispositioned to do this. The only part where this becomes really tragic is in the case of divorces or when parents of different cultural backgrounds get married, because right now the parent who goes with the trans movement basically has an automatic I get the kid button. And so there is a huge cultural pressure to go in this direction during divorces, which happen a lot more in our society than they would have in a historic context.
I believe statistically they've done some research that a very high percentage of the mothers in particular who are oriented this way have personality disorders, have a borderline personality disorder.
Like 50% or something, right?
Yeah, it's quite high. And we're talking about, borderline and or that, that there might be some Munchausen's kind of thing going on because they get a lot of the status, they get all the attention. So the sort of the mom in me is feeling like these poor babies, like who will step in on their behalf and prevent this person who is parasiting their life and their body for her own virtue signal.
Now you understand how they feel about you.
Exactly.
Every emotion you just described is how they feel.
But I'm not trying to.
I'm literally not trying to. From their perspective, if my kid feels like he's a woman or a man, and I am preventing them from transitioning, I am doing literally everything you just said. They say these poor little kids who are born into these conservative cults that brainwash them into thinking that they have to be like every emotion you just described is that the subset of emotions that a progressive watching this podcast is feeling right now.
Worse in some cases, because many progressives very firmly believe that they will end their lives if they don't transition.
Well, so I understand that, but then that's why what I try to do, because I'm not, a hateful human being, and I actually the idea of controlling what somebody else does is repulsive to me at a principled level. I would rather try to persuade. So in other words, I'd rather pull the data and say, I understand that you've been told that your child will kill him or herself. But the data actually doesn't show that. And in fact, the data shows there's a high likelihood they will have that propensity if they do move forward with this prior to the age of maturity, where they have been able to go through the full puberty and come out the other side and then decide. They might still make the same decision, and I'm none of my business, but there are physical, you talk about being efficacious, you need your bones, you need your full brain development. There are certain things that need to develop. So I would rather persuade the parents to please go ahead and let them wear whatever clothes they want, have whatever name they want, use whatever pronouns they want. I'm talking about just purely the medicalization, that if you would like, to go with all of this, but please hold off on the medical decision until your child is physically mature. And then at least they will have a healthy body to go into this life with. Well, that would be my argument.
How do you feel about laws around abortion where when somebody is at an abortion clinic, they need to go through and watch movies of fetuses being aborted and stuff you're aware some states have these laws. Are you pro or against that?
I'm against government forcing anyone to do anything, and it's not my body. And
from their perspective, this is the same. Look, what I'm trying to fight here, right, is I am trying to come up, when I'm thinking about this, when I'm determining my positions, what's a cultural stance that I can take that no matter who's in power leads to the aggregate good for society. So I think that the moment you begin to get to, well, I have these rules around like they're killing a kid. So at the very least, what I need to show is like graphic videos before they make this decision of this happening. I am using the fact that I have earned the right through being the culturally dominant force in a region to use education in these sorts of moments to sort of stack the deck in the favor of the outcome that I want. Whereas the great thing about this movement, from my perspective, is that it does die out on its own after a while.
Well, I just don't think the reason I challenge the abortion analogy only is that you've got an actualized individual, the mother, and a potential individual, the fetus.
The people who are forcing
I
people
understand
to
what the people say.
Don't believe it's a potential individual.
I don't operate in the realm of beliefs. I operate in the realm of actual tangible realities. And the reality is that a born child, is an individuated individual. They are a separate person. They may be small, they may be young, they may be brand new here, but I think there comes a point where putting drugs and putting things that create permanent changes into someone else's body who cannot possibly understand the long-term impact of that, I just question that. I really do. And I don't think that's analogous to say, I'm forcing you to watch a video of a baby being aborted, or I'm going to present you with the data and the statistics on the,
I mean, you understand that the groups
and so on
that are fighting for these abortion videos, they believe that those are real children. Like, you can say you culturally don't believe that a third trimester, a second trimester, wherever you draw the line. But I would say where
first, but I mean,
draws the line at when human life begins is in part arbitrary. It is a cultural decision. And to those groups, they are fighting the same fight you're fighting, because they don't believe that fetus, they believe it's a full human being. And yeah, I guess they seem like the same position to me.
I don't know. Like I don't think they're analogous, but I think when it comes to children whose parents are making decisions on their behalf or allowing them at very young ages to medicalize their transition, and I feel pretty strongly that doctors who take an oath to do no harm at a minimum. So in other words, they can't go just administer these drugs on their own or do these surgeries on their own. They have to involve the labor of others. They have to involve other people who also ought to have a right to say yes or no, right? Theoretically, like if I offer a service, I should be able to say no. And so right now, the political stance of the dominant culture is, no, you shouldn't have the option to say no. If a parent comes to you and says, give my child puberty blockers, then you're going to lose your license. You're a horrible person, blah, 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 whatever, if you don't. And that's what I really think is also a problem. You shouldn't force somebody to do something that they consider to be harmful, first of all. And secondly, I think when it comes to a minor child, that all bits of information should be given. Nothing should be concealed. And I don't think there's informed consent going on. So that's why I kind of draw the line. I don't think it's informed consent when it's a minor child.
Well, do you have thoughts?
I side with you in this case. I've seen the arguments from the other side, and the problem with imposing any sort of what we see to be reasonable standard on another culture is that gives them the right to impose their unreasonable standards or reasonable standards per their perspective on ours. And the simple way, although it feels so wrong, and I totally understand your intuition of like, how could you do this to these children? You're hurting them. It's really difficult. I mean, I'd love a society in which, basically,
I just want the doctors to be allowed to say no.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's fair,
doctors can totally say,
fair.
That's
so
completely fair.
I get where you're coming from. I get where you're coming from in terms of, if you allow this disposition, they could stretch it to the end. And I usually go exactly where you're going with this. But we are right now in a position where, in order to say these parents can do what they want, then doctors are being incentivized, even forced to do certain things, to distribute certain things, mostly incentivized at this point rather than forced. And I think it is skewing the development of this culture, where it's not organic. It is, the incentives are all aligned, whether it's money, whether it's politics, to produce more children like this than the odd parent who says, this is my cultural belief. And that's what's concerning to me, and what I see as a problem is it's not really organic. And it's not their choice in the same sense that we're thinking of choice.
I mean, I definitely understand morally where you're coming from.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm stuck. And I usually don't want to impose my morality on other people. I'm actually quite opposed to that. I just worry about, how the incentives stack up to where the thing that I think is immoral gets propagated without even the individuals involved, like the parents being able to say no. So in Canada right now, even if you're a parent, or even in Montana, we had the case of both parents agreed they wouldn't want their child to transition, and the state took their kid. And this is happening more and more. The state is removing children and transitioning these children. And so if the solution temporarily is, okay, we just don't transition children medically, we wait until they're adults. If that's the sort of tourniquet that we have to put on this, and I guess I'm more comfortable with that than allowing the state to come and take the kid.
Well, I mean, that's the way dominant cultural groups almost always work. If we lived in a Muslim majority country and we were like Christians and our kid decided he wanted to be Muslim, the state would come and take that kid away from us. They'd be like, we got another one. If you live in a Christian majority country and you're Jews, and then one of the kids goes and says, Mom, Dad, I want to be a Christian. He goes and tells the local magistrate, I want to be a Christian. The Christian culture is likely going to find a way to take that kid from the parents, because dominant cultures always sort of dehumanize the other groups that live among them and see them as fundamentally sort of savage and abusive in that they raise their kids within a different context. What's interesting is, and keep in mind, what they're being told. If this kid will kill themselves, that they believe this. A lot of them believe this 100%. Like, if you do not go with this one cultural strategy is gender affirming care, the kid always and every time kills themselves. And that's basically what people are being taught.
Yeah, that's a lie. But then they also say if you don't get baptized, you go to hell. So I mean, it's kind of the same idea. Yeah. Just to wrap up, Malcolm and Simone, can you just once again reiterate for the folks watching what you mean by inoculating your own children? So for those people who want, I think what I'm taking away from this is you're not going to get, so don't bother wanting, sort of somebody else with a bigger hammer to come in from the government side and go, stop it, or whatever. And that what in reacting like that isn't going to be good either. So a better ways to inoculate your own child or your own family. And what are some steps? Yep. You said some of them. What are some things that parents can do?
Biggest ones are old cultural strategies that worked for cultures, because most cultures evolved in areas where they were the dominant culture within that region, that worked in that context. One of the biggest ones I hear from, Christians, whether it's about deconverting or anything like that, is, oh, my kid knows better than to do that. When somebody says that, they're telling me their kid knows better than to tell them if they're having these sorts of doubts. But when they leave the family, they're not going to be doing it anymore. So one is to throw away systems that universally demonize these groups, because that's another thing. If you demonize members, especially of like the trans community, and you're like, they're just bad, twisted, stupid people who have been conned or something like that, your kids will meet, like, there are really nice trans people out there. I have trans friends. It's not like they'll meet that person and then they'll say, what else have I been told that's a lie about this community? And that's a pathway for them to potentially get into this gender dimorphism or dysphoria loop. I would also say,
I think her connection, something happened to her connection. She'll probably come back.
I'd also say just fully traditional approaches to all of this is not really going to be intergenerationally stable in the way it has historically. I think a lot of older cultures, one of the biggest tools that the urban monoculture has is sexuality. A lot of cultural systems developed a lot of prohibitions against sexuality because those prohibitions were primarily used to increase the amount of unprotected intermarital sex during fertile periods people were having. That's why you'll have things like bans of having sex when a woman's not like during her most fertile periods, which you have within some Judaism, or, using porn. So you're more likely to be with your wife, or blah, 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 blah. You're familiar with all this.
So fewer prohibitions, just more, don't demonize. What about presenting? I'm just thinking of like
a cult. I say it's not like an evil cult, like a different religion. Like you're a minority religion within a larger society. And I even think it's useful doing this. I mean, we're even creating this for our family, our own holidays, our own sort of religious systems. So our kids know this is what it means to be a Collins. We are weird and different, and we take pride in that, and take pride in the ways that you are weird and different and your ancestry, etc. And when people come to you, and be aware that this is what it's going to look like when they try to proselytize to you. That you're going to have somebody come to you and they're going to say something like, you generally know what it looks like when a Scientologist comes to you. You generally know. So I think creating this psychological barrier is really helpful in in doing this while not overly demonizing and stuff like that, because that's actually one of the easiest pathways for them to come in.
Well, and I agree with this because I've been advising for the past year. Every time I see people go to the school board meetings and read the passages from the books and scream and yell and whatever, and I kind of cringe after a while, because while they're not incorrect that this material is highly sexualized, a lot of it's pornographic, et cetera, I personally don't like it. I think it backfires because it creates that Streisand effect, and the kids are going to go, where is it? I want to find it. Or you forget the potential backlash from the dominant culture on you and your child to work harder to separate you, to make you the bad guy in your child's eyes.
Yeah.
And like you said, if they go into school and the person who's been presenting this stuff seems all nice and cheerful and friendly, and mom looks like a deranged lunatic screaming and yelling and ranting and raving, it's not far. It's a hop, skip, and a jump from, maybe mom's lying, from that to, so I think it backfires. I don't think it's a good way to go.
And make it clear to your kid that these people think they're saving you. They think that you're helping you. They're just wrong in this assertion. That's when somebody from a different religion comes and tries to convert me, I don't get angry. They think they're helping me. They think that they're saving me. The other thing I'd note is that psychologists of today, and you can go to Basecamp and watch all our videos on psychology because we've done a lot of them, is not the psychology of 20 years ago. It is part of this system now. The moment your
Don't
kid
send your kid to a therapist,
you have lost. Therapists are it is like being mad that Catholics have taken over your region. So you send your kid to what's that called again? Confession. It is the confession of the urban monoculture. It is a mechanism of their cultural outreach. It is completely bought and sold. It is a preacher within their system, and it is not something that you can engage in. This doesn't mean that psychology was all bad. Maybe learn about CBT yourself. Maybe encourage your kids to learn about CBT. CBT is actually good and safe, but that's not what's practiced anymore. Now, what is practiced?
They're teaching cognitive distortion.
Yes,
they're teaching catastrophizing and all the kinds of things that are what CBT tries to undo.
Yeah, actually, we go into this on our, is psychology a cult video, but it uses most of the techniques. Modern psychology is actually much, much closer in practice to Scientology than psychology of 25 years ago.
Oh, yes, I would agree with that. Yeah.
It uses,
I was going to say, like, given all this, and given as some of my commenters are mentioning that the schools, public in particular, but actually also the private schools, they are working overtime to immerse our kids in this, to where our efforts to say, hey, you're a Collins and you're proud of it, we send them in. It would be like sending them to Catholic church every single day, where they're required to do confession every single day, and where everybody around them is going along with and doing it. So as such, do you think that that's too great a sick environment that you should actually quarantine your children? Should you remove your children?
We're building a school system for our kids. It'll be launching this year, the Collins Institute. We're completely rethinking the way education works. We'll do another podcast with you probably about it, and the educational pedagogy was in it. But I would not send my kids to public school unless they really wanted to go. Like they're like, oh, this is just so fun. But if they're not like that,
but okay.
then absolutely not. I do not think it is, and not private school either. Not Catholic school, not all it has infected all of these institutions. The mimetic virus is very powerful within the educational system.
Okay.
If you send your kid out, you are doing, like you say, it's like saying, I don't want my kid to be Catholic, but I'm sending them to Catholic school all day, every day. If you think your culture is strong enough to resist that, it may be, but I would say that the odds are probably stacked against you.
Well, and when you consider the fact that they now they're increasing their staff of counselors, they're putting in social emotional learning programs in every single class. So math, science, everything is going to have a little emotional check-in, and there's affirmations and all the things that are really about the love bombing and about the, your feelings are what matters. And, your feelings are more important than anything real. And so the kid cannot escape. It's not just sending them to Catholic school. It used to be they could send a Jewish kid to parochial school and they still come out Jewish because they weren't constantly like proselytizing in math class.
What's interesting
all the time.
It's not even that it needed to design. If all of this stuff was just designed by malevolent characters, it wouldn't be as effective as it is. It's that the iterations of these systems that were better at converting people, it's literally undergone cultural evolution. Because they don't breed themselves, the iterations that were better at converting outcompeted the iterations that weren't. And intergenerationally, it has almost created you could say supernaturally, because the hand of the market has been at play, powerful psychological tool and it's an existential issue for them, as I've mentioned, the conversion of your kids. So I wouldn't do that, and I don't really think that there's any win for the families that are sending their kids. And people could be like, well, what are my kids supposed to do? Be uneducated? It's like, do you know how terrible the school system is right now?
They're not getting educated.
They're not getting educated. It's one of my favorite was a study by Peter Gray on unschooling. This is like not homeschooling. These are just kids literally do nothing, like a total control. They get into college at higher rates than people who go through public school. They have better mental health than people who go to public school. They graduate college at higher rates. So literally doing nothing is better than public school.
Well, provided they're not on TikTok all day, but yes.
Well, no. Keep in mind, these unschooler kids, they could be on TikTok if they want to. Literally leaving your kid on TikTok all day
that bad? Oh,
is probably better than the public school. Yeah.
I've told people like you can sit them in front of like the History Channel or documentaries all day and then give them a stack of books and some crayons and they're better off. But I mean, I guess whatever.
That. Yeah, they get bored of online if you teach them right. And I think that it's you've got to build ideological reasons and an ideological structure for the kids. This is why we basically built a religion for our kids that is resistant to the pull of things like TikTok. If they only live for their own hedonism, then of course those things will pull them. The great thing is that this hedonistic lifestyle that's glorified by the urban monoculture is most predated by all of these threats in our environment, which leads them to become these sort of sad zombies that's very easy for our children to see. I mean, the most powerful way to prevent your kid from being predated by this is be like, look at the end game for all this. Look at these people. Look at their, like the Ethylism subreddit. Are they happy? They all hate their lives. They're all
that's true. That's actually how I do it. So, I mean, with my daughter, we talk a fair amount about how unhappy, it's like, look at the outcomes, look at how you're doing. And I'd spend a fair amount of time talking about how pleased I am, how proud I am, and observing the positive outcomes of the choices that she's making that I think are effective. So in other words, if she's doing something and to push back, for example, on a friend who's going with this, culty stuff, and I say, I'm really proud of you that you maintained your boundaries and stuck to your values and spoke up for yourself and all that, which of course reinforces it. And then it's like, this is good that I did this. So I try to, I'm not sheltering her and saying, she can be on her phone and things, but we have these conversations. We talk a lot about how she's happier and they're not happy. And not to say, look how miserable they are, but it's more like, is it working for them?
This actually brings me to a really good point, which is one of the signs that you're doing something wrong is that your kids aren't talking to you about engaging with these types of communities.
Correct.
Because these types of communities are everywhere. So if this isn't a regular consternation in your kid's life, it means that they know you won't approve of the conversations they're having with these communities.
I tell people all the time, like the first thing to come, how to help me, what do I do? And I say, well, you need to start having conversations with your children more. Open conversations where you listen and you pull from them what's happening in school. How do you feel about this? Like, tell me about your friends, like get to know what's going on and then try as hard as you can to, rather than judge, either them or the friends I have, like, what do you like about that friendship or what is working for you? What's not working for you? so on.
And here's a crazy thing that I think I'd end with is, while I believe that there are actually individuals born trans, I know you know, but I think it's a real thing. I think even if one of my kids was born trans, because of what the trans community has done to the trans identity, they'd probably be better off emotionally not transitioning.
Yeah, because like I said, when they're not trans when they turn trans, they're everything else too. There's so much additional baggage that you kind of have to go with now if you're turning trans, which, to Malcolm's point,
yeah, I mean, look at what they did to Caitlyn Jenner when she defected from their positions and she had a wrong think political opinion.
Right.
You enter like the urban monocultures, like we'll say mental health cult, where you're also suffering from trauma and your parents messed everything up for you and you're helpless and you need to see a therapist for the rest of your life. So there's just so much additional harmful baggage independent of transition that, yeah, we would even be concerned then.
Yeah. All right. Well, wow. So much to chew on. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys. I realize, audience, that this is a lot. I know it's a lot, and it's also 2 hours and 20 minutes, but there are many things to think about here. I hope you will all give some serious thought to your individual reactions when these things come up and how you plan to help your kids work through this, and just a lot to chew on. Thank you so much for certainly giving me.
Check out Basecamp, our podcast.
Yes, please check out Basecamp.
Or the collinsinstitute.org if you want to learn more about our educational system.
Yes.
Or the pronatalism.org if you're interested in the pronatalism movement. But really, Basecamp's the easiest place to sort of see us and engage with us. So thank you so much.
A lot of good stuff there. Thank you so much
for your work.
Thank you also for yours. And it was great to meet you guys. And thank you to the whole audience. Please like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you again next time. Bye-bye.